Hey guys, tonight we're going to find ourselves on the edge of a cold, wind-worn rock, perched somewhere along the Atlantic coastline of 19th century America, where the salt spray stings your eyes and your boots never quite dry, and where your mornings begin, not with sunlight or birdsong, but with the heavy creak of rusting hinges and the unmistakable sigh of a door too old to care about subtlety. You stand in the half-darkness of a lighthouse keeper's quarters, just a cot, a stove, and a shelf of suspiciously identical books, while outside, the fog gathers itself like a wool coat pulled tight, pressing against the windows and refusing to go anywhere until it's good and ready, which could mean hours or days or most of your adult life. You haven't spoken to another human being in over a week, and the only voice you've heard is your own muttering at the seagulls, who, to be fair, started it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your feet touch the floorboards. They're cold, always cold, and you shuffle your way across to the stove, where a dented kettle has been sitting dry since yesterday afternoon, which you forgot, of course, because your thoughts are as foggy as the weather. The fire's gone out completely, so you fumble with the flint and steel for what feels like the 12th day in a row, trying to convince a reluctant flame to come alive and not embarrass you in front of the lighthouse cat, who's probably watching, silently judging, from somewhere under the cot. Eventually, after enough sparks, curses, and soot on your thumbs to rival a coal miner, the fire catches. The kettle wheezes like an old man asked to dance, and you leave it there, knowing it will boil eventually, probably long after you've gone up the tower. You tug on your heavy coat, thick wool, damp in the sleeves, and permanently holding the scent of fish, oil, and whatever it is that happens when salt air meets loneliness, and shove your feet into boots that still have yesterday's sand clinging stubbornly to the soles. The climb begins. 127 steps. You know this because you've counted them many times. In fact, you count them aloud every single morning, partly to track your progress, and partly to prove to yourself that you still know how numbers work. Step 12 is loose. Step 37 creaks ominously. Step 92 has a nail that catches your boot lace if you're not paying attention, and by the time you reach the top, your breath forms small clouds, the cold slapping your cheeks with the kind of persistent sharpness that makes you wonder whether your nose is still attached or has quietly resigned. Inside the lantern room, the great Fresnel lens, your crown jewel, your enormous, finicky, radiant responsibility, waits like a sleeping beast, its many glass facets already beaded with condensation. The thing cost a fortune when it was hauled here, piece by piece, on a cart, pulled by donkeys that were definitely underpaid for their suffering. And it's your job to keep it clean, fueled, and spinning. No pressure. You move with slow, deliberate care, pulling a dry cloth from your belt and wiping down the glass panes in gentle, circular motions. Because even though no one's around to check your work, You can practically hear the voice of that inspector from last spring saying, "Keepers who neglect their lens are keepers who court disaster." As if disaster hasn't already been courting you every day since you took the job. The fog is thick today, thicker than usual, even for late autumn. It rolls in from the sea like an overgrown dog that's forgotten it's not welcome on the sofa, licking at the base of the lighthouse, swallowing the rocks, hiding the sea. You can't even hear the waves. That's when you know it's bad. When the sound of the surf disappears entirely, like the ocean has decided to hold its breath and let the silence do the talking. Still, the lens must be lit. You reach for the oil canister, unscrew the cap, and pour a careful stream into the lantern's fuel chamber. The scent of whale oil hits you instantly. Sharp, fatty, a smell that gets into your clothes and never leaves, no matter how much scrubbing or swearing you apply. Historians still argue whether the transition to lard oil in the mid-1800s was really for cost efficiency, or just because every lighthouse keeper from Maine to the Carolinas staged a quiet rebellion by smelling like soup stock for half their lives. Either way, you've still got barrels of the stuff. And this one's leaking a little, which you ignore for now because it's a problem for future you. The wick is trimmed, the fuel is in, and with a practiced flick of your flint, the flame catches. It flares for a moment, always a moment too bright, and then settles into its slow, steady glow. You close the access panel, latch the brass hooks, and step back. It's beautiful, in a way only repetitive things can be. This daily ritual, this solitary ceremony with no congregation, where the only witness is the fog and the occasional seal that barks its disapproval from the rocks below. You stand there a while, watching the light turn, feeling the weight of the tower under your feet, noticing how the condensation creeps back onto the glass the moment you wipe it away, like the ocean is playing some petty joke, reminding you that you're never really in control. And you accept it because control left you the day you signed up for this job, and realize that the sea doesn't take orders, it gives them. Down below, the cat meows exactly once, which is her way of reminding you that she exists, that it's breakfast time, and that you're profoundly late. You begin the descent, 127 steps. Again, backwards now. Your knees creak in harmony with the staircase. You pause at step 37, press down on it just to hear the groan again, and chuckle because, after all, it's good to have company, even if that company is an aging piece of wood. You step into the keeper's quarters, where the kettle is finally singing its off-key tune. You pour the water over grounds that might be older than some towns, and sip from your chipped enamel mug with the word hope stenciled in fading paint on the side. It was a gift, you think. Or maybe it came with the job, or maybe you just like the irony. Outside, the fog still hasn't moved. You suspect it's planning to stay the whole week. Inside, the light burns on, and so do you. You stare at the lantern glass for so long that the fog outside begins to feel like a second set of walls, and you find yourself wondering, again, whether the ocean even exists today, or if the entire coastline has simply vanished into a thick soup of damp invisibility, swallowed by clouds that forgot where the sky ended and the sea began, and are now just sitting here, sulking, suspended over the rocks like a very passive-aggressive ghost. Inside the lantern room, your breath fogs the glass again, and you groan, quietly, not from frustration exactly, but from the knowledge that you're about to do the same thing you did yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. Because cleaning this lens isn't a one-time task, or a twice-a-week task, or even a when-it-looks-bad kind of chore. No, it's a daily ritual, a sacred rite, an endless polishing of glass that never quite stays clean, no matter how lovingly, how obsessively, how prayerfully you scrub it. You reach for the cloth again, the same cloth you've used so many times that its corners are soft as seaweed and fraying like a widow's shawl in the wind. And you begin, slowly, methodically, wiping one curved pane after the next, like you're caressing the back of a whale-sized monocle, careful not to smudge the precious optics that let your light stretch 22 miles into the dark, wet unknown. Because even though it's hard to tell from here, even though you rarely see another soul for weeks, someone, somewhere out there, is probably depending on this light to guide them away from disaster, or at least to make them feel slightly less alone in the vast emptiness of the nighttime sea. It's a strange kind of intimacy, really. This relationship you have with the lens, with the sea, with ships you never meet, and sailors you never see. They don't wave, they don't call, they don't even write. But you polish the lens all the same. Every morning, every evening, every moment. It fogs or smudges or gathers the tiniest fleck of salt crust. Because it's the only part of this job that feels like it matters. And because, let's be honest, you don't have anything better to do between breakfast and sundown. And even if you did, you'd still choose this act of pointless devotion, this quiet battle against the sea air, because it gives you purpose, even if no one else notices. The seagulls do not appreciate your effort. They sit just outside the lantern room on the rusting iron railing that wraps around the tower, like a belt on an overfed man. And they scream, loud, nasal, undignified screams that sound less like birdsong and more like unpaid actors trying to be enthusiastic about dry toast. One of them, a particularly bold fellow with a missing toe and the eyes of someone who's seen things, flaps up to the window and pecks at the glass exactly once, as if to say, "Still here, are you?" And then waddles off without further comment. Historians still argue whether lighthouse keepers in the 1800s went quietly mad from isolation, or whether they started mad, and the job just gave them a nice place to do it in peace. Some claim the government provided early training manuals with helpful tips like talk to the cat, not the furniture, and if you name the fog, change its name every week to avoid forming emotional attachments. Others say the silence was the appeal, that there was something sacred about the stillness, the ritual, the utter predictability of a life reduced to weather reports, lamp maintenance, and boiled potatoes. You pause in your cleaning, cloth in one hand, oil-smudged glove in the other, and glance down at the jagged rocks below. They're barely visible through the mist, just dark shapes shifting under veils of white and grey, like ghosts of old shipwrecks waiting to happen again. You squint, just in case something is out there. A boat, a seal, a message in a bottle. But of course there's nothing. Just the fog. Just the gulls. Just the sea pretending it's not there. The glass is clean enough for now. You step back, admire your handiwork for exactly 3 seconds, and then notice another smudge forming in the corner. You decide to ignore it. For now. Mostly because your back is starting to ache, and also because it's almost time for second breakfast, which is entirely different from first breakfast in name only, but gives your day a comforting structure. Like chapters in a very boring, very damp book. You make your way down the spiral staircase again, each step echoing softly, rhythmically, like a heartbeat inside a seashell. And by the time your boots hit the bottom floor, the familiar smell of whale oil and damp wool has wrapped around you again like an old friend who never learned about boundaries. The kettle is still warm, miraculously, and you reheat the last of yesterday's coffee, if it can still legally be called coffee, while pulling a biscuit from the tin on the shelf, the one labeled Tuesday, despite it being Thursday. Because labeling anything accurately would feel like admitting that time matters here, which between you and the mildew, it definitely doesn't. The biscuit is dry, the coffee bitter, and your thoughts drift lazily as you chew. Toward the logbook, toward the ink bottle that always clogs, toward the coal pile that's suspiciously low again, despite no one else using it. You wonder, not for the first time, whether the Lighthouse cat is stealing coal for some unknown purpose. Perhaps a tiny stove of her own, perhaps a small trade economy, with mice who've unionized. She won't say. She never does. You glance back toward the tower, where the light turns slowly in its great glass crown, slicing the fog like a lazy knife. And you feel, strangely, content. Not happy, not joyful, but that deep, slow kind of contentment that comes from repetition, from quiet responsibility, from knowing that your entire world is contained within a stone cylinder, and that nothing unpredictable ever really happens, unless you count the time a pelican flew into the side of the tower and left a very undignified, beak-shaped dent. Outside, the wind shifts. Not much. Just enough to make the fog swirl a little, revealing a sliver of sea, a glimpse of horizon, before it curls back into itself, like a cat settling into a nap. You sip your coffee again, wincing slightly, and lean back against the doorframe. The gulls scream, the lens spins, the biscuit crumbs fall into your lap. And you, lighthouse keeper, hero of the invisible coast, sentinel of the salt-slick rocks, you prepare to do it all again tomorrow. You sit down on the splintered wooden bench by the window, the one that always tilts slightly to the left, like it's given up resisting gravity, and place your lukewarm coffee beside you on the sill, where the condensation from the glass will almost certainly leave another ring-shaped stain that you'll notice tomorrow. Forget to wipe, and then eventually start counting just to break the monotony. Though you suspect the stains now outnumber your conversations this month, which is really saying something considering how verbose the lighthouse cat can be when she's in the mood to scold you for breathing too loud during her naps. Your breakfast this morning consists of a wedge of cheddar that smells faintly like betrayal. A single slice of bread so stale it might as well be a building material. And of course, the traditional hardtack biscuit, also known by sailors as molar breaker, weevil surprise, and the only reason dentists got rich. You know it slowly, your jaw working at a pace that even a tortoise would call leisurely, and stare out at the fog-slick horizon with the practiced indifference of someone who's seen every possible combination of grey sky and greyer sea, and still occasionally finds themselves fascinated by how utterly, relentlessly, nothing ever seems to happen. You add a tiny spoonful of molasses to your coffee, mostly because it's the only indulgence left on the shelf that hasn't turned to dust or leaked down the back wall like last month's jar of pickled onions, which you still haven't had the emotional strength to clean. As the bitter sludge of the coffee hits your tongue and the hardtack continues to resist digestion, you feel a peculiar sort of satisfaction. A pride not born of pleasure or accomplishment, but of endurance, of surviving yet another morning, where the biggest thrill is discovering that your tin cup hasn't yet rusted through completely. Historians still argue whether lighthouse keepers were allowed fresh supplies more frequently than twice a month, or if the tales of extended isolation were exaggerated by melodramatic journals and the occasional maritime novelist who never actually lived in a lighthouse, but liked the idea of noble solitude. What they don't often mention is how the real test wasn't the food shortages or the weather. It was the sheer number of hours in a day that required filling with something other than staring at barnacles and swatting at flies that had somehow developed the ability to mock you with their wing beats. You shift your gaze to the table, where a single fork lies at an odd angle, and you briefly consider repositioning it, just to see if doing so will change the atmosphere of the room. You don't. Instead, you pick up your fork and poke the remaining crumbs of your breakfast into a neat pile, organizing them by size for reasons you don't bother to justify. Because out here, no one questions your habits, not even the cat. And frankly, she's been judging you since you arrived. There's a kind of quiet majesty to a meal eaten without conversation, without interruption, without even the pretense of entertainment. No newspapers, no radio, no chattering guests filling the air with nonsense. Just the sound of the wind playing mournful tunes through the gaps in the shutters, and the occasional thump of something probably not important hitting the side of the lighthouse like a forgotten chore tapping to remind you of its existence. You chew, you sip, and you stare, not at anything, not for any reason, just because it's what comes next. The cat enters, of course, because no moment of solitude is truly complete until it's interrupted by a creature that demands affection on a schedule it refuses to share with you. She pads across the floor like she owns every plank, every knot in the wood, and every crumb of cheese still clinging to your plate. She meows exactly once, a short, clipped sound that you interpret as a sarcastic, "Breakfast again, is it?" before leaping onto the table with the grace of an opera singer and the arrogance of a duchess. You ignore her, she ignores you harder. A game begins. You finish your coffee and set the cup down slowly, deliberately, as if performing a ceremonial act. She knocks it over. The coffee, blessedly, was nearly gone, but the dramatic symbolism of her action is clear. She disapproves of your breakfast, your posture, or possibly your entire existence. You nod in acknowledgement. Respect must be paid. It's around this time that the fog begins to thin, just a little. Enough that you can see the outline of the sea stretching toward the horizon like a cold iron sheet, mottled with darker patches where waves roll without enthusiasm. No ships, no sails, not even a drifting barrel or a particularly enthusiastic seagull. Just sea and more sea. The kind of view that might have once inspired poetry, but now mostly makes you wonder how much longer until you're supposed to write in the logbook again. Speaking of which, you reach for the weather journal, its leather cover worn smooth by your fingertips, and years of mild contempt. You flip it open to today's page and write, in a script so neat it could be accused of showing off. Fog persisting, no vessels sighted, wind from northeast, coffee disappointing. You pause, add cat judgmental, then underline it twice for emphasis. Historians still argue whether logbooks were read regularly by Lighthouse authorities or if they were mostly performative documents, like public diaries, meant to prove that, yes, you were doing your job. And yes, you were technically sane, at least by early 19th century standards, which were admittedly generous. One former keeper once wrote 3 full pages about the philosophical implications of a snail on his windowsill, and no one batted an eye. You're pretty sure if you started doodling in the margins, no one would notice, unless the doodles started forming coherent maritime critiques. In which case, someone at the Department of Lighthouses might accuse you of insubordination through art. You close the book, stretch your arms, and yawn so wide it feels like your jaw might detach, just for something new to do. The cat watches this with detached interest, as if waiting to see whether you'll actually fall apart this time or just sigh and go dust the map again. Spoiler. It's the map. You make your way to the wall and regard the faded paper pinned there with 4 mismatched nails and 1 thumbtack of dubious origin. The map, showing the coastline in painstaking detail, has a small dark smudge where your lighthouse sits, a mark you added yourself using soot from a candle that should have been thrown out months ago. You trace the shoreline with your fingertip, imagining ships you'll never meet, harbors you'll never visit, lives bustling just out of reach, like whispers behind a door you're not allowed to open. Your finger stops near a cluster of rocks, ominously labeled Wreck Point. You think about how many ships met their end there, how many sailors may have stared through the fog, hoping for your light, and found only jagged teeth of stone. You wonder, not for the first time, whether your own lighthouse has saved more ships than it's watched disappear, and whether anyone will ever tally that balance sheet. Outside, the wind has picked up slightly, just enough to make the lantern housing above your head groan, a sound so familiar you don't even flinch. It's almost time to check the gears again, but not quite. Instead, you sit back down at your little table, take one last bite of the rock-hard biscuit you never liked, and feel, in the slow stretch of the morning, the weight of a life that no one sees but you. The fog hangs stubbornly over the sea, like an elderly house guest who refuses to take the hint and go home, lingering in thick swirls around the base of the tower, swallowing the rocky shoreline until even the most confident boulder seems to disappear into ghostly mist. And as you press the pen nib against the rough paper of the logbook once more, that same paper now tinged a faint yellow from age and salt air. You draw a slow, deliberate line beneath today's previous notes and begin a new entry with the kind of enthusiasm normally reserved for scraping barnacles off the hull of a fishing boat at low tide. Cloud cover unbroken, fog stationary, temperature unseasonably mild, no vessels sighted. And then, after a brief internal debate with your sense of propriety, you add, cat remains smug. You sit back, gently closing the logbook, as if it might bite you for putting so little of substance inside, and place it on the wooden shelf, where it lives between a water-warped almanac and a pencil that has been chewed to such a stubby end. You've started to suspect the cat may be using it to write her own private journal in retaliation for your commentary. The air smells faintly of kerosene and fish oil, the usual blend of utility and despair that has settled into the walls like a second layer of paint. And outside, somewhere in the blinding white void of the fog, you hear the distant call of a gull that sounds, with no exaggeration, exactly like someone yelling the word "why" into a metal funnel. You rise with exaggerated slowness, the way one does when trying to both protest the necessity of movement and also avoid creaking every joint in protest, and shuffle over to the tiny window near the spiral staircase that winds its way up to the lantern room above. You wipe away a smudge of condensation with your sleeve, though in truth, it may have been there since Tuesday, or last month, or 1847, and peer out, hoping for even the smallest glimpse of something, anything, that might qualify as movement or excitement. But there is only mist, and the outline of the rocky outcrop below, and the vague, shadowy flicker of the kelp beds, gently swaying under a tide you can't even hear. Lighthouse keeping, as you've discovered, is an occupation so defined by routine that any deviation, even a spilled spoon, a crooked logbook entry, or a bird flying in the wrong direction, can feel like a full-blown emergency. And yet, here you are again, noting the sameness of it all in crisp cursive, because someone, somewhere, might one day care about what the weather was doing on this utterly forgettable Wednesday. In the year of our Lord, 1876, historians still argue whether these daily logbook entries were ever read with true interest by the Lighthouse Board back in Washington, or if more likely, they were just filed away in dusty basements next to half-empty inkwells and surplus shoe polish, destined to be rediscovered by a curious intern centuries later, who would marvel at the sheer volume of nothingness described in such meticulous detail. In the meantime, you document it anyway, because not doing so would feel like a crime against the very structure you live in, and besides, the ritual has become as much a part of you as the worn leather slippers you refuse to replace, even though one sole now flaps like a gull's wing with every other step. And so, your morning continues. You place the logbook back on its designated shelf, ensuring the spine aligns perfectly with its neighbors, because order matters here in a place where disorder would multiply rapidly, like mildew on a forgotten tea towel. You glance again at the barometer nailed to the door frame, still low, still threatening rain, or melancholy, or both, and decide it's time for your daily rounds. which is a generous way of describing your highly choreographed walk in a tight circle, through rooms you've memorized, down to every chip in the floorboards. Up the staircase you go, one hand on the wrought iron rail, your footfalls echoing like forgotten piano notes in the tall, cylindrical shaft of stone that smells faintly of moss and engine grease. The stairs creak with every step, though they've never done more than complain, and you whisper apologies to them anyway, just in case they're waiting for an excuse to give way and deposit you in an ignominious heap halfway between the oil room and the observation deck. At the top, you push open the trapdoor and emerge into the lantern room, where the great Fresnel lens stands like a sleeping giant, its many glass facets catching the faint grey light of the day and fracturing it into delicate rainbows that dance briefly on the walls before vanishing again. As if embarrassed to be caught in such a dreary location, you circle the lens slowly, checking for cracks, smudges, any hint of soot that might obscure the beam when night falls again, and the sea begins its nightly performance of sighs, crashes, and occasional misplaced barrels. You wipe one of the prisms with a soft cloth, just once for show, and then peer out across the sea again, hoping against hope that some distant masted shape might appear through the veil of fog, like a forgotten plotline returning in the final chapter of a particularly boring novel. But no, just mist, and maybe the suggestion of a seal lounging on a half-submerged rock, though it could also be driftwood wearing a hat. Either way, it doesn't wave. Returning down the staircase, you reflect on the singular honor of being the only human soul in a 10-mile radius who has any idea how clean the third westernmost prism in the northern half of the lens currently is, which gives you an odd kind of pride, like being the world's foremost expert on folding laundry in zero gravity, or the only person alive who can identify seagull footprints by species and political alignment. You pass the oil room and instinctively check the barrels, though you already know exactly how full each one is, because you've been doing this for months and could probably identify them blindfolded by their specific creaking noise when nudged. They're fine. Or at least they're not leaking, which is all you ask of them at this point. You pause to sniff the air, just in case. Still kerosene, still fish, still Lighthouse. It is now just past midday, and the realization hits you with the weight of a damp wool blanket. You have done everything you needed to do today, and it isn't even close to dinner. The rest of the afternoon stretches before you like a featureless expanse of sea, occasionally stirred by waves of mild anxiety or nostalgia, depending on whether you accidentally glance at the corner where your childhood photograph sits inside a cracked frame that smells of salt and old promises. You walk to the supply room and open the drawer where you keep your envelopes. Empty as usual, and then the drawer where the stamps live, which is somehow full, despite the fact you've sent precisely 2 letters this entire season. One was to your cousin, the other to a tinsmith in Boston, requesting a replacement hinge for a box you later decided you didn't really need. After all, the fog outside hasn't moved. Neither has the cat, who now lies sprawled across the top step of the tower, like a velvet gargoyle, guarding the entrance to the lantern room with the solemn duty of one who knows you'll bribe her with sardines eventually. You step over her, bow slightly out of respect, and descend once more into the waiting quiet. A breeze stirs through the open door, smelling of damp rope, crushed seaweed, and the kind of possibility that only ever lasts until about 4 in the afternoon, at which point it gets replaced by the smell of stew and mild regret. You stand for a moment at the threshold of your humble domain, breathing deeply, trying to feel something resembling purpose. A single gull dives past with a shriek, heading toward nothing in particular. And that's the day so far. The smell hits you first. A soft, unmistakable hint of old fish, warm metal, and damp wool carried on the breeze even before you descend the narrow stairwell to the storage level of the lighthouse. And it curls up into your nostrils with the stubbornness of a childhood memory you thought you'd outgrown. Except this memory has weight and leaks, and the consistency of something that really should not be leaking indoors. Yet here you are again, standing in front of the whale oil barrels like some half-disbelieving apothecary, staring at the slow, glistening trail of amber syrup snaking its way across the floorboards, as if the building itself were quietly weeping about its job. It's the 3rd time this month, maybe the 4th. You've lost count, not from neglect, but from sheer emotional fatigue. And although you briefly consider blaming temperature fluctuations or gravity, or the ghost of a clumsy assistant keeper from 1832, who probably tripped while trying to eat stew and haul oil at the same time, the truth is far less poetic and far more mundane. The seal has split, again in precisely the same spot it always seems to give way, just beneath the iron band where the wood swells in damp weather and shrinks in dry. A subtle but relentless process that makes you wonder whether whale oil barrels were ever truly designed to last, or if they were secretly meant to fail just often enough to keep lonely lighthouse keepers from losing their minds completely to the rhythm of isolation. You sigh, not loudly or dramatically, but with the quiet resignation of someone who's come to understand that fixing things is less about solving problems and more about resolving the same exact problem over and over again until you die. And you fetch your mop, the one with the split handle and the lingering scent of pine tar and moldy rope, and begin the slow, squelching process of pushing the glistening trail back toward a rag pile that looks less like cleaning material and more like the ghost of a defeated laundry basket. As you clean, you hum, mostly tunelessly, occasionally slipping into fragments of sea shanties that were probably never meant to be sung alone in a leaking supply room. But then again, most things in life were never meant to be experienced entirely solo. And yet here you are, duetting with a puddle of marine mammal lubricant under flickering lamplight. In a building so remote, the seagulls have started naming you in their conversations. The oil continues to ooze in a kind of lethargic defiance, and you think, not for the first time, about how peculiar it is that whale oil, for all its reputation as a marvel of industrial lighting, behaves more like syrup than anything else. Slow, clinging, hard to remove from boots, floorboards, and the inner lining of one's soul. And even though modern historians have detailed the massive scale of the whaling industry in the 19th century, with ships sailing as far as the Pacific to hunt leviathans just for a few casks of this stuff. There's still debate about whether it was truly the most efficient fuel available or just the most profitable, depending on who you asked and how guilty they were feeling about the whales. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of whale oil was a necessary evil of the industrial age, or merely an avoidable cruelty built on poor planning and bad economics. But as far as you're concerned, here and now, the only argument worth having is whether mopping up the leak before lunch is better than pretending you didn't see it until after dinner. You opt reluctantly for diligence, and you patch the barrel the best way you know how, with a scrap of canvas, a sliver of driftwood, and enough sailor's twine to make a modest fishing net. And then reinforce the repair with the same rusted clamp you've used for years, the one that pinches your fingers every time you forget which side is supposed to face the wall, which is always. It holds mostly, or at least appears to, which in Lighthouse terms is considered a win. And you wipe your hands on your apron with a grim sense of accomplishment, like a gladiator who has survived a particularly slippery beast in the arena of maritime maintenance. You open a window to let out the worst of the smell, though the breeze that blows in doesn't help much, and instead seems to stir the air just enough to relocate the scent to new corners of the room. And you make a mental note to scrub the mop bucket, which you immediately forget in favor of more pressing matters, like retying the bandage on your left thumb that you've managed to snag on a nail for the third time this week. The cat arrives at the threshold precisely on cue, as she always does when the air thickens with the scent of crisis and dampness. And she regards the puddle with a kind of disdain that suggests not only disapproval, but also an implied accusation that you've allowed this to happen just to amuse her. She does not help. She does not blink. She merely turns around and walks away again, her tail flicking like a comma at the end of a very sarcastic sentence. You take a deep breath and step out into the corridor, oil-streaked and contemplative, and make your way back toward the keeper's quarters, where you briefly consider changing your shirt before deciding that if no one's going to visit for another 3 weeks, and the cat clearly doesn't care, then neither should you. You plop into your worn wooden chair with the sort of relief usually reserved for collapsing tents or long overdue naps, and you glance at the clock, which informs you, almost smugly, that it's only 1:43 in the afternoon. Time in a lighthouse has a way of defying logic, stretching itself into yawning gaps where hours crawl by on their elbows, while entire weeks can vanish in a blink. And although you have meticulously kept the schedule recommended by the Lighthouse Board, including inspections, cleanings, and 3 meals per day, it's hard not to feel sometimes like time itself is circling you slowly, waiting for you to drop your guard so it can sneak up and rearrange the furniture in your memory. Outside, the wind whistles low and soft through the cracks in the stones, a gentle reminder that the weather is always watching, always shifting, always preparing its next quiet intrusion. And as you look out across the grey sea, you catch the faintest shimmer of light on the waves, perhaps a promise of sun or a passing ship or just a trick of the mist playing games again. You pick up the logbook and write, "Oil barrel leaked. Patched again. Wind southwest. Cat judgmental. You put the book down, sigh again, and begin the long, slow process of preparing the evening meal. Because if there's one thing more reliable than a leaky oil barrel, it's the fact that you'll be hungry again by 5 o'clock. And nothing fights despair like boiling potatoes in the company of a judgmental feline and the scent of seawater slowly reclaiming the windowsills. You begin the morning the way all great tragicomedies begin, with a tin of polish in one hand, a bundle of tarnished brass knobs in the other, and a sinking feeling that today will be one of those days where progress is measured not in achievements or revelations, but in the number of rags you destroy, trying to make dull things shiny again, despite the deeply philosophical question that lingers at the back of your mind like a persistent mosquito. If a brass knob gleams in a lighthouse and no one is around to see it, does it gleam at all? Or is the act of polishing simply its own reward? A small rebellion against entropy and the inexorable slide of all things into dust. The brass knobs, for their part, do not resist you. They're too far gone for pride, but they do seem to sulk, each one bearing the grimy imprint of time and salt air, their surfaces mottled with greenish veins that speak of years spent quietly oxidizing, while storms battered the tower and seagulls screamed obscenities into the fog. And now it falls to you, the eternal custodian of things no one else remembers, to revive these glinting circles of forgotten importance, to coax back their luster with lemon oil and elbow grease, and the kind of muttered curses normally reserved for spilled soup or inkwells left open overnight. The table creaks beneath the weight of your ambitions, or perhaps just beneath the accumulated detritus of a life spent hoarding small, shiny burdens. And as you lay out the tools of your trade, like a weary surgeon preparing for a series of unnecessary cosmetic procedures, you remind yourself that the Lighthouse Board did issue a directive back in 1859 encouraging keepers to maintain all visible brasswork in presentable and immaculate condition, a phrase which sounds noble in theory, but in practice has become your personal Sisyphean loop, an endless parade of knobs, hinges, and fixtures that have no functional value, but must nevertheless gleam like the inside of a banker's pocket watch. Historians still argue whether these meticulous standards were born from genuine safety concerns. Some suggest polished brass was easier to spot in smoky conditions, or whether it was simply an extension of Victorian fussiness, a cultural obsession with appearances that led to ironed undergarments, perfumed handkerchiefs, and the inexplicable popularity of mustache wax, even in storm-ridden outposts. You polish anyway, because deep down, you know the real enemy isn't corrosion or even tedium. It's the creeping fog of purposelessness, that murky dread that settles in when your days begin to blur into one another, when the tick of the clock becomes indistinguishable from the scrape of your own footsteps, and when the only person congratulating you for a job well done is the same person who just spilled a drop of polish on the cat's tail. She does not appreciate the new fragrance. In fairness, neither do you. The rag is already stained with yesterday's oil mop-up, which gives the brass a slight nautical tang. But you press on, scrubbing until your knuckles ache and your fingertips go numb, and the knobs begin to reflect something close to a distorted version of your own face. worn, smeared, faintly ridiculous, like a carnival mirror left out in the rain, and you find yourself laughing, softly, at the absurdity of it all, that somewhere out there, in the great swirling ledger of human endeavors, your name might one day be attached to a footnote that reads, "Notable for his unmatched commitment to doorknob aesthetics." You briefly imagine a grand tour, a series of velvet rope exhibitions in which museum goers from Boston to Baton Rouge shuffle past lovingly lit glass cases filled with your most polished brass. The lighthouse latch from September, the gleaming stair hinge of May, the famously symmetrical cupboard pulled from the fabled autumn of '73. And somewhere in the crowd, a child tugs their parent's sleeve and whispers, "I want to be like that someday," while a docent recites your logbook in hushed, reverent tones. You shake the thought off before it becomes a manifesto. Outside, the waves beat steadily against the rocks, a rhythm so familiar now that you rarely hear it unless something goes wrong, unless the waves are too loud or too soft, or are suddenly accompanied by the panicked bleat of a foghorn that you haven't heard in decades. And inside, the faint ticking of your wall clock joins the chorus of tiny creaks and sighs that the lighthouse offers as background music. A slow, groaning lullaby of warped wood and age-softened bricks. You move on to the hinges, not because they need it, necessarily, but because once you've begun, it feels criminal to stop halfway. Like painting only one cheek of a clown or icing only the bottom layer of a wedding cake. And as your cloth slides over the ridged metal with a satisfying hiss, you wonder idly whether anyone has ever truly admired a door hinge, truly stood there, staring at its quiet curves and whispering, "Ah, yes, this is craftsmanship." And if not, whether perhaps today is the day you begin such a tradition. The cat watches you with renewed suspicion, perched atop a shelf of spare lantern wicks, like a judgmental librarian evaluating a dubious manuscript. And when you reach for a knob that's resting near her tail, she bats your hand with all the enthusiasm of someone enforcing a poorly defined but strongly felt boundary. You apologize, not because you mean it, but because in the architecture of your day, even small conflicts with the cat carry weight, and you cannot afford another cold shoulder tonight when the wind begins to shriek through the eaves and the warmth of another living being, however disdainful, becomes the only comfort available in a room built entirely from shadows and regret. By mid-afternoon, the brass has taken on a faint golden gleam, a shimmer that catches the slanting light just enough to justify the ache in your shoulders and the faint ringing in your ears from leaning too close for too long. And you lean back in your chair, survey your work like a king inspecting his unimpressive but technically functional kingdom, and take a moment to marvel at the strange economy of your life. How entire hours can vanish into the crevices of a doorknob, and how meaning, that elusive substance, seems most easily found not in grand moments or sweeping declarations, but in the act of refusing to let even the smallest thing remain unloved. You make an entry in your logbook: brasswork attended, cat uncooperative, cloud cover medium. And you underline the word attended as if to reassure yourself that even attention, even brief, distracted attention, is an act of preservation, a resistance against forgetting. And you wonder not for the first time. If maybe the lighthouse is less about light and more about memory. A vessel for the accumulation of tiny, unremarkable moments that somehow hold the structure together when storms come. You finish your tea? It's cold, of course, but it still tastes faintly of bergamot and salt, which feels oddly poetic. And as the shadows begin to stretch long and slender across the floor, you tuck the polishing cloth back into its drawer, slide the knobs into their compartment like rare coins, and tell yourself, quite seriously, that tomorrow you'll take the day off. Then you remember the lantern room. Windows haven't been cleaned since last week, and also the railing on the south balcony might have rusted again, and you might need to recheck the oil barrel patch, just to be safe. But for now, the brass gleams, and that, for today, is enough. The day stretches on with all the urgency of a sloth crossing a gravel path. And by the time the tide turns and the gulls begin their late afternoon bickering over something shiny and irrelevant on the shore, you are already halfway down the creaking staircase to the narrow dock. Because today, though no one sent a telegram, rang a bell, or even coughed in your general direction, is mail day, which means that somewhere on the horizon, moving at the speed of enthusiasm on a cloudy Tuesday, the mailboat is allegedly making its way toward your isolated speck of responsibility, bearing with it the sum total of civilization's attempt to contact you. One envelope, sometimes two, and if you're really lucky, a paper-wrapped package of crackers that will already be stale by the time you open them. You squint into the briny haze, eyes watering from the persistent wind that never seems to know when to rest. And eventually, like a turtle dragging a sack of grudges, the mailboat comes into view, piloted as always by a man whose expression suggests he has not enjoyed a conversation since the previous administration, and would rather be anywhere else. Except he keeps doing this, week after week, and you suspect, though neither of you would admit it, that some small part of him finds comfort in the regularity of your awkward nods, your unspectacular handoff, and the brief shared glance that says, "We're still here, still alive, still pretending this makes sense." When the boat bumps gently against the wooden pilings, he tosses the parcel up toward you with the casual precision of someone who has done this at least 500 times, then mutters something you cannot decipher. Could be a weather report, could be a commentary on the price of cod, could be the lyrics to a sea shanty that no longer exists. And by the time you retrieve the envelope, he's already backing the vessel away. His hat pulled low, his shoulders hunched like a question he's not ready to answer. You don't wave. He doesn't look back. And so the ritual concludes. Back inside, you place the envelope on the table, as if it were a sacred relic, its corners softened by fog, its ink smeared just enough to suggest a damp pocket. And you stare at it longer than you need to, letting the anticipation build, not because you expect something extraordinary, but because opening mail has become the closest thing to surprise your life offers. Your version of fireworks, of curtain reveals, of dramatic third act twists. And you savor the slowness, the rustle of paper, the way the flap tears unevenly and leaves a little fuzzy edge like the torn wing of a moth. The letter inside is from your cousin Horace, whose grasp of punctuation remains debatable, but whose commitment to writing monthly updates on life in Eastport has not wavered in 7 years. And you appreciate him in the same way. You appreciate sturdy boots or dried beans. Unexciting, perhaps, but reliable. And given your current lifestyle, reliability is the closest thing to affection you dare ask for. Horace writes of rain, of course, and of his garden's persistent failure to produce anything but rhubarb, and of a cat that might be pregnant or might just be unusually round, and of the neighbor's boy who is now apprenticed to a tinsmith but hates tin and has developed a passionate interest in frogs, which Horace believes is concerning but not yet criminal. And you chuckle softly at this phrasing, imagining the boy in question, pockets bulging with amphibians, dodging polite society while dreaming of swampy greatness. He also includes a drawing. This time it's a pelican with what appears to be a monocle and a cane, standing next to a fish that is either sleeping or dead, labeled Reginald the Polite Pelican and his unfortunate friend. And while it's unclear what this has to do with anything, you tack it onto the wall near the pantry door, where it joins a growing gallery of Horace's artistic crimes. Stick figures in top hats, lighthouses with expressive eyebrows, and a surprisingly emotional rendering of a sandwich that once made him cry. You make a note in your logbook. Mail received. Horace still alive. Pelican noted. And you find yourself oddly buoyed by the exchange, as if the envelope carried not just paper and ink, but a faint gust of air from somewhere less lonely, a whisper of distant streets and garden rows and porch chairs, where people still sit in 2s and 3s and complain about the wind, instead of just absorbing it into their bones. You consider replying. You always do. And maybe this time you think, maybe this time you'll describe the fog as a character. Give it a name. Luther, perhaps. And tell Horace about the way the sea has been humming lately, like it's practicing for a concert you'll never be invited to. And how you've started talking to the tower walls when the wind gets too quiet, just to see if they'll talk back. But you don't. Not yet. Instead, you make tea. Because that is what one does after receiving mail, just as one does after failing to receive mail, or burning one's toast, or stepping in a puddle, or noticing that one's trousers are becoming less theoretical and more whole than fabric. And as the kettle hisses its slow exhale, you let your thoughts drift like driftwood, bumping gently against the edges of memory and dream, and wonder whether lighthouse keepers in other parts of the country are also boiling water right now, writing in logs, polishing things that don't need polishing, and waiting for boats that may or may not bring anything worth waiting for. Historians still argue whether lighthouse keepers in the 1800s were more isolated than their seafaring counterparts, or simply differently alone, tethered to a fixed point, watching the same waves curl and break day after day, while the sailors rode those waves toward adventure or shipwreck, toward glory or oblivion. And there's something both comforting and tragic about that distinction, like comparing two kinds of exile and deciding which one is more poetic. Your tea tastes vaguely of rust. You drink it anyway. The letter remains on the table long after you've finished reading it, as if the ink is still settling, still becoming real. And every time you pass it, you glance at the address, at the familiar scrawl, at the place where the stamp's corner peeled up just slightly. And for a few seconds, you allow yourself to imagine walking down the streets of Eastport again, nodding at strangers who vaguely remember your name, stepping into the grocer's shop, where the floorboards creak like old dogs stretching, and telling Horace in person that Reginald the Pelican is your new role model. The cat, who has ignored you for most of the day, jumps onto the chair beside you and sniffs the envelope with the solemnity of a customs inspector, then curls into a loaf and closes her eyes, her tail flicking once, as if approving your moment of human connection before returning to the important business of napping through history. You pet her gently. She pretends not to notice. Outside, the wind picks up again, tugging at the shutters, rattling the glass just enough to remind you that the world is still turning, still breathing its salt-laced breath against the face of your little tower. And somewhere beyond the fog, another boat cuts through the water. Another letter is written. Another lighthouse flickers into life. But for now, you sit. The letter is open, and the tea is, by some miracle, still warm. By now, as the light outside slinks away in slow motion, never quite deciding whether to fade gracefully or stage a dramatic retreat, you find yourself, predictably, standing in front of the massive logbook once again, that cracked leather-bound tome, which has long since ceased to be a record of maritime events and has instead evolved into your quiet confessional, your secret therapist, your nightly ritual that replaces prayer, diary, and calendar in one, where you dutifully mark the weather, the ships you didn't see, the chores you didn't quite finish, and, because no one's checking anymore, small anecdotes like found 3 spoons in the rain barrel, unclear how, or dreamt I was a sandwich again. The logbook smells of ink and salt and time, and the quill you dip into the slightly congealed pot of ink squeaks the faintest protest, as if even it has grown weary of your circular observations, your nightly musings that somehow always find their way back to the fog, the wind, or the curious way the sea seems to forget where it left its edge. Tonight's entry begins slowly, not because you lack things to say, but because there's something strangely ceremonial about writing in this light. Just before the lamp oil is trimmed for the final watch, when shadows lengthen in a way that makes the shelves look like cliffs and the chairs like sleeping travelers. And you find yourself writing not just for clarity or duty, but for the sheer tactile pleasure of pressing nib to page and watching the letters bloom like seaweed beneath the tide. You write of gulls, of course. You always do. But tonight, they were behaving particularly oddly, clustering around the tower, not with their usual bored menace, but with something that could almost be interpreted as concern or hunger, or possibly a complex form of emotional manipulation, which wouldn't surprise you, given that one of them has been limping for 3 weeks, and you're half convinced it's a ruse to earn extra bread crusts. You write of the clouds, of their strange elongated bellies that looked at sunset like someone had taken a ladle to the sky and poured out a soup of light and shadow. And you note that the wind came from the east with a hint of pine, which probably means a storm has bumped into the coast somewhere up the line, perhaps scattering fishing boats like so many silver teeth knocked from the mouth of the sea. And then, as you often do when your hand has found its rhythm and your brain has finally agreed to wander. You begin to ramble in the margins, drifting into half-thoughts and parentheticals, wondering whether anyone else logs the moon's mood swings the way you do, or if they've noticed that the lighthouse cat has developed a new habit of sleeping precisely beneath the pulley that lowers the lantern, as though she has made a pact with gravity itself. Historians still argue whether lighthouse logs from the 1800s were genuinely meant as precise scientific tools, or simply as a way to keep the mind tethered to something other than the waves, something other than the creak of wood and the silent threat of solitude. And you suppose both can be true? That a record can be both useful and poetic? That a man can mark the passing of fog, not because it matters to navigation, but because it matters to him, because he needs to say aloud, even on paper, "I saw this, I was here." You close the logbook with a soft thump, not a dramatic one, not the kind they use in courtroom dramas or tales of pirates, but the gentle kind that means, "That'll do for today." The kind that signals to the mice in the cupboard and the spider by the window that things are winding down, that the storytelling portion of the evening is now concluded. And then, of course, comes the climb. The spiral stairs groan under your familiar weight. Each iron step slightly uneven in a way that your body has memorized without effort. Like an old song whose verses shift, but whose chorus never changes. And as you ascend, the light from your small lantern bounces in lazy arcs, illuminating bolts, rivets, and the occasional mysterious cobweb that seems to respawn no matter how many times you sweep. At the top, the lantern chamber awaits you like a dozing dragon, glass-paned, round, and echoing with the faint drip of condensation. With a great Fresnel lens, that crown jewel of maritime safety, stands at rest between rotations, waiting for the night to call it into motion again. You check the oil, of course. You always do. Even though it rarely needs it. Even though nothing has gone wrong since the incident with the soot clog 3 winters ago, which you still refuse to talk about. Even to the cat. You wipe the lens with the special cloth, the one embroidered with the initials of a long-retired keeper, whose meticulousness was legendary, and whose ghost you sometimes invoke when debating whether to polish clockwise or counterclockwise. And tonight, in his honor, you go counter just to keep him humble, too. Outside the windows, the world is wrapped in a velvet murk, the sea reduced to texture and rumor, and the only lights visible are your own reflection, the occasional blink of a far-off buoy, and the ambiguous flicker of a lantern from a fishing vessel that may or may not actually be there. It is peaceful, which is to say, it is the kind of quiet that feels slightly too still, as if the universe is waiting for something to happen, and you feel a strange obligation to disappoint it by doing absolutely nothing. You sit, not on the stool that's too wobbly, but on the sturdy wooden crate that once held oil but now holds your rear, and you rest your elbows on your knees and listen to the mechanical heartbeat of the rotation gears, the tick-for-tick that reminds you that this whole enormous contraption, this lighthouse, this miracle of engineering and paranoia, is ultimately powered by human habit and stubbornness. You think about that phrase, lightkeeper, and how misleading it is, how it suggests something noble or heroic or poetic, when in truth, Most days, it's just you fighting mildew and loneliness and the inexplicable desire to yell into the sea, just to hear if it yells back. You think about how many keepers have sat exactly where you're sitting now. Hundreds, maybe thousands. Men who wore heavy coats and smelled of lamp oil and salt, and whose only connection to the rest of the world came once a week on a boat, whose arrival was based more on weather and whim than any postal schedule. Did they think, like you do now, about what would happen if they simply walked away? Did they fantasize about packing a small satchel with a boiled egg and a pair of socks and just rowing toward the horizon, letting the sea decide whether to punish them or forgive them? Did they wonder whether the light would miss them? Whether the waves would notice? Probably not. They probably just worried about whether they remembered to wind the mechanism, or if that one rusty gear was going to hold through the night, or whether the jar of pickled onions was still edible. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the work itself, the repetition, the mundanity, the absolute lack of drama is what kept them sane. Because when the sea is loud, you want silence. And when the sea is still, you want routine. And when your whole life is defined by the brightness of a single revolving beam, you cling to anything that casts its own small warm glow. Like letters, like logbooks, like the cat's tail twitching in time with the rotation gears. Down below, a kettle begins to rattle. You'll have tea again, because what else is there? You're not quite sure when exactly the storm started. If it was born with a single sigh, somewhere far off the coast, or if it had been gathering itself silently behind the sky like a disappointed schoolteacher preparing a long overdue lecture. But by the time you notice the first shiver in the glass panes of the lantern room, it has already grown into something large enough to command respect, though not mercifully, large enough to warrant fear. At least, not the kind of fear that sends you scrambling for oilcloths or muttering desperate half-prayers to sea gods you pretend not to believe in. No, the storm is the familiar kind, the kind that belongs to lighthouse keepers like boots belong to fishermen, the kind that arrives like an uninvited uncle, loud, blustery, a little sad around the eyes, but who always leaves without breaking anything important, except maybe your ability to finish a cup of tea before it goes cold. You descend the spiral staircase slowly, your lantern swaying with each creaking step, casting warped shadows on the stones that seem to shift and breathe like living things, and the lightning flashes outside. Back in the keeper's quarters, you check the shutters, just like you did 2 hours ago. And probably 2 hours before that. Not because you expect them to have magically burst open, but because part of the job, perhaps the largest part, is checking things again and again, long after they've stopped needing to be checked. As if your vigilance alone keeps the walls upright and the sea politely outside. The stove hisses softly, a pot simmering on it with a watery stew of questionable age, and the cat, who detests storms even more than she detests canned fish, is buried beneath a blanket in the laundry bin, her tail flicking like a metronome, ticking out a tune only she can hear. You move your logbook to the edge of the table, the safest distance from the occasional raindrop that slips through the old stonework like a forgetful ghost. And you begin to write. Wind from the southeast, barometer falling, gulls silent. You pause. That last detail always unnerves you. The gulls are obnoxious and smug and opportunistic, but they are also consistent. And when they go quiet, it feels like the world has slipped off its hinges. Just slightly. Just enough to make you glance at the corners of the room as if something might be hiding there. Historians still argue whether the keepers of remote lighthouses suffered more from the isolation or the monotony. And while you think that's a charmingly academic debate, you would gently suggest that perhaps the true answer is both. That the slow suffocation of sameness is only made worse by having no one to roll your eyes at during dinner. No one to make sarcastic remarks to when the wind blows the outhouse door off again. No one to confirm that, yes, that cloud really does look like a chicken holding a parasol. Your thoughts are interrupted by a dull thud from upstairs. And for one brief second, you imagine the lens has fallen, shattered, left you defenseless against the endless darkness. But no. It's just the weather vane slamming against its bracket again, loosened by the wind or perhaps by rust or perhaps, in some mythic mood, by the sigh of Neptune himself, who must surely be bored by now, watching you scribble the same notes day after day, while his waves perform operas outside. You light the second lamp, the smaller one, more ceremonial than practical. Its light no match for the great beacon above, but comforting nonetheless. And you place it near the window so that passing ships, should any be foolish enough to be out in this weather, might see a sign of life below the main beam, a flicker of human presence, a reminder that the great tower is not entirely run by ghosts and gears. The wick sputters at first, unsure whether it wishes to join the party, but eventually settles into a gentle flame that paints your knuckles gold as you cradle your hands near it for warmth you don't really need, but want all the same. You sit for a while without moving, not sleeping, not exactly thinking, just sitting, the way one does when they have reached the exact middle of something and realize that there's no point rushing to the end. The storm outside rises to a kind of lopsided crescendo, the wind howling with that peculiar theatricality it reserves for tall buildings and lonely men, and the rain taps against the window in polyrhythmic nonsense, as if trying to compose its own symphony, but refusing to commit to a single-time signature. Eventually the cat emerges, glaring at you as if you're personally responsible for the thunder. And after a brief inspection of her dish, she sits at your feet and begins to clean her ears with the slow, meditative precision of a monk copying scripture. You consider, for the 100th time, naming her something majestic, like Hecate, or Nightshade, or Lady Celestina Fluffington. But as always, you find yourself simply calling her Cat. And she, with her infinite feline dignity, accepts this without complaint. The hours pass, or rather they drift. Time in the lighthouse during a storm behaves more like a curious fish, visible only from the corner of your eye, quick to vanish if you look directly at it. And you begin to lose track of what part of the night it is. You check the clock, not because you care about the hour, but because it's ticking, feels like company. And you find that it is not far from the time when the mailboat might arrive, though you doubt it will come today. Mailboats are supposed to be regular, dependable, the fragile link between the lighthouse and the rest of the continent, But in reality, they are as prone to mood swings as the weather they sailed through. Sometimes they come early, bearing newspapers 3 weeks old and biscuits that are somehow both stale and damp. And sometimes they skip a week entirely. And you spend days pretending you didn't mind, that you didn't really want that letter from your cousin, or that catalogue of new boots you definitely can't afford. Still, you find yourself preparing for its possible arrival anyway. Sweeping the front step, trimming the wick of the gas lamp, folding the ancient oilcloth into a shape vaguely resembling welcoming, because routine is sacred here. And hope, even small and irrational, must be honored like a visiting noble. You glance again at the waves. Nothing. Just foam and blackness and the vague idea of motion. But you wait, and you listen. And even though you know the boat will not come today, because no captain in his right mind would challenge this weather, you find yourself imagining it anyway, just to keep the silence from growing too thick. You picture the little vessel bobbing and groaning, its deck slick with spray, its lone crewman swearing into the wind and wondering, not for the first time, why he agreed to this job. You imagine the captain's tea sloshing in its mug, undrunk, and the way his boots squeak as he adjusts the rudder. And you think, just for a second, that maybe you'll see that faint light emerge from the mist. You don't. But the imagining is enough, for now. You write one last note in the logbook. Storm persists. Spirits fair. You underline it, twice. Some mornings begin with a burst of light, a kind of radiant announcement that the worst has passed, that the storm has raged itself tired and collapsed into the arms of calm seas and contented gulls. But not today. Today, the sunrise, if it exists at all, is a dim shrug of colorless sky. A half-hearted gesture from behind a veil of mist, so persistent, so committed to its own role, that you wonder if the sun might simply skip the whole performance and let the day unfold in soft grays and muted sighs, like a stage play with no actors, only props and rustling curtains. You stir slowly, your body unsure whether it has truly rested. Your joints not quite squeaking, but certainly muttering complaints. And as you rise from the thin mattress with its lumpy stuffing and the familiar smell of salt, old wool and cat, you feel a curious sensation. The lighthouse is too quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of normal mornings when the sea hums like a contented throat clearing and the wind taps the shutters like an impatient child, but a stillness so thick it feels padded, like you're walking through a memory rather than a room. The logbook waits for your hand, and you begin the daily ritual of writing down everything you see and don't see, because both matter, apparently, in the vast archives of Lighthouse records. Barometer holding steady, fog heavy, visibility low, wind direction variable. And for a moment, as your pen scratches across the page, you wonder who actually reads these entries, whether anyone in some dusty office back on the mainland pores over your notations with any real interest, or if it all simply becomes another layer of bureaucratic sediment, stacked atop years of identical observations. Historians still argue whether these logbooks were more valuable as meteorological records or psychological ones. Some scholars comb through them looking for patterns in weather. Others read them for glimpses into the minds of isolated souls, losing track of themselves amid fog and repetition. And while both interpretations have their charm, you suspect neither fully captures the truth. That these books are a quiet form of self-preservation, a way to prove you were here, that you notice things, that you were, in some small way, attentive to the passing of time in a place where time prefers to fold in on itself, like waves into sand. You make tea or something close to it, a warm liquid that carries the illusion of comfort, even if its taste is closer to boiled linen. And you sip it slowly, while watching the fog press its face against the windows, like an overeager ghost. Outside, the rocks are barely visible, even though you know them by heart. The shape of the tide pool with the single starfish, the jagged ledge where cormorants sun themselves, the cluster of mussels that scrape your boot if you step too far to the right. And yet, in the mist, they all vanish, swallowed by a world that refuses to admit it has edges. You decide, mostly out of habit rather than necessity, to inspect the lens above, climbing the narrow spiral staircase with a grunt and a wheeze, each step worn smooth by your own feet over the years, until you reach the lantern room where the great glass eye waits in silence, half lit by the dull daylight trying to squeeze through the cloud cover. You wipe the panes with an old cloth, more out of reverence than utility, and check the oil supply even though you filled it last night, because one can never be too careful when entrusted with the task of keeping ships alive through light alone. There is something sacred about the lens, something almost ridiculous in its beauty. How the brass fittings gleam when polished, how the prisms catch stray beams of light and bend them like quiet spells. And though you know it's just a machine, just a marvel of 19th century engineering designed to focus beams across vast, indifferent waters, you still feel a kind of affection for it, the way one might feel for a loyal old dog or a particularly dependable hammer. Below, the cat has claimed your chair, a silent protest against your absence, and you nudge her gently aside with a half apology as you sit and return to the business of the day, which mostly involves being present, being observant, being still. A ship horn sounds faintly in the distance, low, mournful, the kind of sound that feels like it belongs to another century. And you lean forward instinctively, eyes scanning the fog, trying to guess its direction, its speed, its type. You think it's a coastal schooner, maybe one of the packet ships that still lumbers between towns like a mailman with sea legs. And you watch for any sign of it, even though you know it'll pass, without ever drawing close enough to be seen. These ships rarely need the lighthouse during the day, and even when they do, they rely on the beam more than the man who tends it. A reminder that your job is both essential and invisible, the way breathing is. You make a small mark in the log. Horns from west, probable schooner, and then return to staring at nothing. The kind of nothing that is full of slow movement, of subtle shifts in light and moisture, of gulls that appear and disappear like punctuation marks in the fog. The gulls have returned, which you take as a good sign, although they're already fighting over a piece of seaweed, screeching in that way that suggests they believe every moment is the most important moment in bird history. You remember something from a letter long ago. A cousin who visited a lighthouse once and described it as peaceful. And you smile because peaceful is such a delicate word. Not quite big enough to hold the complex stew of solitude, vigilance, boredom, and awe that simmers beneath the surface here. Still, you suppose it's not wrong, just incomplete, like calling a violin a box with strings. Technically accurate, spiritually insufficient, historians still argue whether lighthouse keeping was a form of noble service or a kind of slow punishment. And you imagine both camps shaking hands in agreement if they could sit where you do now, wrapped in a blanket that smells of coal smoke and damp wool, sipping tea, while the fog leans against the door like an old friend who never says anything but refuses to leave. Afternoon sneaks in like a rumor, the kind that never quite becomes a fact. And you decide to step outside for a breath of air that isn't second-hand from the stove or the cat. The wind has shifted slightly, cooler now, with a trace of something metallic in it. Iron, maybe, or just imagination. And you descend the outer stairs, carefully, boots slipping a little on mossy stones as you make your way toward the rocks. The sea is restless but not angry, heaving in long, slow motions like a creature dreaming fitfully in its sleep. And you find yourself whispering nonsense to it, as if it might answer back. You do that sometimes. Not full conversations, just murmurs, jokes, observations, as if your voice might ripple out into the mist and find another pair of ears, another heart tuned to the same lonely frequency. On the rocks, you find a bit of driftwood, shaped vaguely like a spoon, and you carry it back as if it were treasure, even though it's splintered and soft and entirely useless. You'll place it on the shelf with the others. Bits of shell, a shard of green glass, a rusted nail bent like a question mark. Not for decoration, but as proof that the sea has stories to tell. Even if you don't always understand the language. The afternoon fades slowly, each minute dragging its feet as if reluctant to move forward. And you light the lamps again, one by one, your hands performing the steps without needing your mind's permission. You open the logbook, write a few more lines. Visibility still low, no landings today. And then pause, pen hovering before adding something unexpected. Fog smells sweeter than usual. You don't know what you mean by that, but you write it anyway, because not everything has to be explained. Some things just have to be noticed. Nightfall arrives slowly, like a tired guest who removes their boots at the door, sets down a dripping coat, and gives a polite nod before settling into the armchair by the fire, saying nothing, demanding nothing, simply being there. And you, long familiar with this guest, greet it without ceremony, without urgency, simply rising from your creaky chair to tend to the lamp once again, because the light must stay lit, whether the sky is black, velvet, or cloud-stained silk, whether ships are passing by or not, whether you feel awake or like a marionette made of oatmeal and old rope. You climb the tower stairs for the third time today, not because anything needs fixing, not because anything is wrong, but because climbing the stairs gives your body something to do and gives your mind permission to loosen its grip on the endless loops of thoughts about whether the roof needs patching or the beans are sprouting mold, or if the cat is plotting something particularly diabolical. And as you reach the lantern room and step into the quiet hum of kerosene and turning gears, you find a kind of comfort in the glow of the Fresnel lens, spinning slowly, sending its careful pulses of light into the night like a heartbeat for sailors you'll never meet. There is no sound as satisfying as the gentle click of the mechanism. No sight more hypnotic than the refracted beam stretching out over dark water, cutting across fog and moonlight like a sword that only fights confusion, not enemies. And you sit there for a while on a crate that once held canned peaches, watching the light do its work, remembering a time when you thought the world was full of adventure, but not yet aware that solitude could be an adventure too, just one with quieter monsters and no dragons to slay, only thoughts, habits, and the slow erosion of self into routine. You recall a story, possibly apocryphal, about a keeper who carved a full chess set from whalebone during a particularly brutal winter, painting one side with squid ink and the other with soot, playing against himself for months and keeping meticulous records of each game as if he weren't also the opponent, as if some impartial future might one day analyze his strategies and understand him better than he understood himself. And you wonder whether that's more eccentric or more sane than talking to the cat, or singing sea shanties into the wind, or naming each passing gull after American presidents in order of their feather color. Historians still argue whether lighthouse keepers were chosen for their reliability or for their disposability, whether the government saw them as trustworthy stewards of vital infrastructure, or as bodies cheap enough to leave on remote outposts with a gallon of oil and a handbook. And although both views likely have merit, you prefer to think of yourself as a curator of liminality, a guardian of that mysterious space between danger and safety, darkness and light, land and sea, where one good decision made at the right time can keep a ship from meeting its end against the indifferent fangs of coastal rock. Back downstairs, the cat is asleep again, this time inside the cupboard with the spare towels, her tail peeking out like a punctuation mark you're not sure how to interpret. And you move quietly through the kitchen, boiling water, not because you want tea, but because the whistle of the kettle reminds you that the world still has cause and effect, that actions still create results, even if those results are just warm air and a small cloud on the window pane. You eat a slice of bread that could legally qualify as sandstone and smear it with something vaguely sweet, possibly jam, possibly regret. And you chew slowly, listening to the wind begin to stir with a little more intent, a little more sharpness in its voice. Not quite a storm, but maybe its opening monologue. And you glance at the barometer on the wall, which seems to agree. It has dipped slightly, just enough to make your stomach tighten, with that ancient sailor's intuition that things might get interesting soon. The thing is, out here, interesting rarely means fun. It usually means leaks, power outages, and the peculiar joy of retrieving fallen shutters in the rain while trying to remember whether tetanus shots are still effective after 6 years. Still, storms have their place in the rhythm of your life, as necessary as quiet dinners, or sweeping the floor, or talking to ghosts that probably don't exist. The logs show patterns. You've noticed that. And the worst storms always seem to arrive just when things have gotten too quiet, as if nature itself becomes uneasy with the lack of drama and decides to stir the pot with a bit of theatrical flair. So you gather your tools, rope, lantern, extra oil, that one hammer with the bent claw that you still trust more than the newer one, and you lay them out in a neat little row by the door. Not because you expect to use them tonight, but because it's better to be prepared, better to show the storm you're not impressed, not intimidated, just respectfully aware of its potential and entirely capable of surviving whatever tantrum it chooses to throw. And then you write in the log again, pen scratching softly across the paper like a mouse in a library, noting the drop in pressure, the shift in the air, the strange hush that often precedes loud things, and you pause before finishing the sentence, caught by the way your own handwriting has become looser over the years, less tidy but more confident, as if your hand has finally stopped pretending to be someone else's. You wonder whether someone will read these entries one day, maybe a historian looking for first-hand accounts of coastal weather, or a novelist hunting for details to fill out a character's backstory, or a teenager who stumbles across a box of forgotten papers and decides, just for fun, to decipher the life of a person who lived in the same space, but under an entirely different sky. You hope they laugh at some of your jokes. You really do, because it's all well and good to be remembered as reliable or brave or detail-oriented. But it's even better to be remembered as someone who knew how to find humor in the creak of floorboards, or the way seagulls always seem to poop on freshly scrubbed windows. The evening drifts onward, the stars peeking out one by one like shy children at a school play. And you step outside once more, lantern in hand, walking the perimeter of the property like a sentinel from some lost civilization, inspecting the fence, the storage shed, the rain barrel with the hole you still haven't patched, and you pause to look out over the sea, which gleams now with a kind of oily sheen, black and silver, restless and secretive, and you find yourself whispering again, not to it, but to the night itself, as if it might respond in riddles or lullabies. There's a story you once heard, possibly true, possibly not, about a lighthouse keeper who vanished during a storm, leaving behind a half-written letter and a perfectly made bed. And the locals say he became part of the fog, still wandering the coastline, looking for something he forgot to finish. And while you don't believe in ghosts exactly, you do believe in unresolved endings, in the way people can be pulled away by currents that aren't made of water. You return inside, lantern still lit, and settle into the chair by the stove, the heat wrapping around you like an old coat. And you pick up the book you've read 17 times already, flipping to a random page because linear storytelling lost its appeal somewhere around month 5, and you begin to read aloud, your voice barely above a whisper, not for yourself, not for the cat, not even for the wind, but simply to fill the space with something that isn't silence. Historians still argue whether solitude sharpens the mind or softens it, whether living alone with your thoughts leads to deeper wisdom or gentle madness. But sitting here with the steady hum of the lens above and the weight of your blanket across your knees, you think it might do both. And that's not such a bad thing after all. You open the logbook again, not because there's anything particularly urgent to record, but because the act itself feels grounding. A ritual tether in a world made mostly of waves and wind and slowly warping wood. The ink glides easily tonight, smoother than usual, as if it too has grown weary of resisting and is finally submitting to the quiet rhythm of this isolated life. And so you write without looking up, letting the words flow more like musings than official notes. Lens clean, fuel level steady, wind from northeast, laundry still damp, dreams last night strange. And it occurs to you that perhaps someone, someday, might read these scrolls and try to extract meaning or pattern, not realizing that half of what's written in Lighthouse logbooks was simply an attempt to feel real to oneself, to avoid disappearing into the fog, not physically, but mentally, to hear your own thoughts bounce back from paper when there's no one else around to listen. The day outside is gray in that indecisive way coastal mornings tend to be, with the sun making half-hearted gestures behind a curtain of thin clouds while the waves slap against the rocks in a rhythm that feels tired, or maybe just bored. And the gulls, bless their screechy, ragged little souls, are back to their usual harassment of the laundry line, pecking with surgical intent at one of your socks, which, admittedly, has holes in the heel and may no longer qualify as clothing by any civilized standard, but is still your sock, and you retrieve it with only a mildly theatrical sigh, muttering about the ungrateful avian tenants under your breath as you clip it up higher this time, out of reach of beaks and judgments. Your boots squelch a little from the morning dew as you walk the perimeter, checking for signs of erosion or rogue driftwood, or anything the sea might have delivered in the night without announcing itself properly. And you pause for a moment by the cliff edge, watching the water heave and collapse like a breathing thing, alive but somehow uninterested in your presence, as though it has seen too many lighthouse keepers to bother remembering another. And in that thought, there's something strangely comforting, a reminder that while your world may be ruled by checklists and chimney soot and the slow decay of paint, the ocean just keeps being the ocean, eternal, unflustered, and unwilling to be impressed. You return to the tower with a new appreciation for silence, for the way it wraps itself around you like a woolen shawl that smells faintly of salt and rust and loneliness. And as you begin your weekly polishing of the brass fittings, yes, again, even though you did it 3 days ago, because brass tarnishes like it has something to prove. You wonder, not for the first time, if any ship captain has ever truly noticed how clean your railing knobs are, or whether it's all just part of the keeper's quiet code of honor, to maintain not because anyone sees, but because the doing itself matters. Historians still argue whether the isolation of keepers like you contributed to a higher rate of mental instability, citing journal entries that veer into the poetic or the unhinged, depending on interpretation. And while it's true that you once spent 4 hours inventing an elaborate backstory for a particularly charismatic barnacle growing near the waterline, you would argue that this is not madness, but creativity, or perhaps just resourceful companionship. And anyway, that barnacle had real narrative potential, especially when the limpets join the subplot. The air inside the tower is heavy with the scent of whale oil and damp wool and something indefinable, perhaps the ghost of every soup you've ever made. And as you lift the lens hood to inspect the glass, you marvel again at its precision, the way each prismatic ridge bends the light, just so, transforming a simple flame into a beacon that slices through mist, like a truth you can't quite name. And it strikes you then how odd it is that you, someone who once couldn't commit to finishing a library book, are now the sole custodian of this powerful eye in the sky. This mechanical priest that blesses the sea with its steady blink. Outside, the wind shifts again, carrying with it the scent of seaweed and maybe a suggestion of rain, though the clouds haven't yet decided what kind of afternoon they're going to be. And you stand in the doorway for a long moment, sipping weak coffee that tastes more like regret than caffeine, watching a crab skitter sideways along the rocks, as if it too has errands to run. And for a moment, you consider calling out to it, offering unsolicited advice about avoiding gulls and staying hydrated. But instead, you just nod, acknowledging its hustle in the way that fellow workers do. The day stretches, not like a yawn, but like a cat, slow, luxurious, unapologetically indifferent to your plans. And you find yourself reorganizing the pantry for the 4th time this season, aligning cans of beans by expiration date, grouping hardtack by firmness, even dusting the shelf where you keep the emergency chocolate. You've told yourself you're saving for a real crisis, but actually, nibble from every time a storm sounds particularly melodramatic. Somewhere mid-afternoon, you retrieve the weather report cylinder from the hook outside. The canister feels cold against your fingers, its metal slick with condensation, and inside is the usual note, hand-scrawled by a clerk whose penmanship you've come to admire, not for its elegance, but for its unwavering consistency, a kind of bureaucratic poetry. Barometer steady, winds variable, no mail this week. Regards, CT. You read it twice, partly because the message is short, and partly because the rhythm of the words feels familiar now, like a friend who only ever speaks in one-sentence summaries. And you wonder idly what CT looks like, whether they wear their hat at an angle, whether they too feel unseen and necessary at the same time. You tag the report to the inside of the cupboard door, where you've started a small, informal archive of such things. Not because they're valuable, but because they form a timeline of your solitude. Proof that even in isolation, you are part of a quiet network of strangers doing small, important things with care. The stove clicks as you light it again, preparing an entirely uninspired dinner of tinned fish and potatoes that have begun to sprout ambitions of becoming plants. And as you peel and boil and season with more hope than skill, you hum a song whose lyrics you've long forgotten, but whose melody drifts up the staircase and through the halls, like a message to the past versions of yourself who also stood here, cooking, waiting, thinking, humming. Night comes gradually, the kind of twilight that doesn't announce itself, just slowly replaces one shade of gray with another. And the lantern's first flicker feels ceremonial, like lighting a candle in a chapel that's made entirely of wind and stone and solitude. And once again, you find yourself marveling at how such a small flame can hold so much responsibility, can represent safety and warning and guidance and presence all at once. You log the evening conditions, adjust the wick, check the windows, and then, as the cat settles in her usual spot on the windowsill, you sit with your book. The same one you've been reading for weeks now. The plot meandering like the coastline, but comforting nonetheless. And somewhere between chapters, as the waves thrum their slow lullaby against the cliff, and the gulls offer a last half-hearted squawk, you feel something like contentment settle over you. Not dramatic or poetic or even worth writing down. Just a small, persistent warmth, like a well-worn blanket or a remembered line from a letter long ago. And with that feeling curling gently in your chest, you close the book, mark the page with a torn corner of last week's weather report, and prepare yourself for another long, slow, silent night. The morning comes in stages, as it always does, beginning not with a sunrise that bursts heroically over the horizon, like in paintings or poems, but with a gradual, reluctant brightening, a softening of the dark that begins at the edges of the sky and works its way inward like spilled milk on grey paper, until finally you realize, somewhere between your first stretch and the second sip of lukewarm leftover tea, that the new day has arrived, whether you invited it or not. And your duties, like the tide, wait for no dream or dawdle. You roll your shoulders, feel the pop in your neck, and reach for your daily ledger, the leather binding warm from its spot beside the stove, its pages thick with past observations and complaints, and the occasional haiku you swore you'd never share. And as your pen scratches across the paper with that familiar, hesitant authority, you find yourself noting the weather. Mild breeze from the southeast. Visibility fair, clouds low and pouting, but also the movement of the cat, who has decided today is the day to knock over the ink pot, leaving a long smear like an abstract coastline across the bottom margin of your page, which you consider keeping as it adds character. And besides, the idea of trying to start over is more exhausting than it's worth. You step outside, lantern extinguished now, its great lens shuttered and resting like a sleeping eye, and the world greets you with that peculiar mix of salt, damp wood, and the faint metallic twang of seagull opinions shouted from above. The rocks are slick and shining from last night's tide, barnacles glistening like tiny soldiers in formation, and you take your usual walk down the path toward the dock, a path more imagined than paved, worn into the grass by repetition rather than design. A daily ritual that reassures you that some things, at least, remain consistent, even as the world pretends to spin. There is mail this time. Astonishing. And the small brown satchel slung over the postman's shoulder is handed off with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred relics or good coffee, and you nod with ceremonial gravity as you accept it, even though the contents will likely consist of a supply inventory list, an updated weather chart, and a letter from a cousin who insists on sending unsolicited clippings about newfangled inventions like typewriting machines and self-winding watches, as if these marvels could ever replace the solemn, dignified rhythm of ink and oil and steady hands that your life depends on. One letter, though, bears a different hand, slanted and delicate, and unmistakably unfamiliar. And you pause before opening it, savoring the moment like a child unwrapping a rare sweet. Because in a place where every sound is either wind, wave, or stove hiss, the appearance of a new voice, even written, is like a fresh breeze through a window you didn't realize had been closed. And you unfold the parchment slowly, as if the words might be fragile or shy, or possibly enchanted. It's from a woman named Emmeline, a schoolteacher from Boston, who has been assigned to correspond with lighthouse keepers as part of a new initiative to promote literacy and connection among remote public servants. And while the phrasing smacks of bureaucratic optimism, her tone is disarmingly warm, speaking of her students' misadventures in spelling, the antics of a rogue goat who has taken up residence near the playground, and her curiosity about what your daily life is like. "Do you ever get bored?" she asks, which you find both funny and oddly poignant, since the answer is yes, but not in the way people think, more like a slow dissolving of urgency than a lack of things to do. You sit with her letter for a long time, rereading certain lines as if they might rearrange themselves into deeper meanings, and you consider how to reply. Should you tell her about the gulls who seem to hate your hat? Or the way the foghorn sometimes sounds like it's trying to say your name? Or the strange satisfaction of aligning the oil cans by height, even though no one but you will ever see them? And you decide, finally, that maybe you'll just describe the smell of the lighthouse at low tide and let her imagine the rest. Because sometimes the poetry of this place lies in what you don't explain. Historians still argue whether the so-called lighthouse loneliness was more a romantic invention of 19th century novelists than a lived psychological phenomenon, pointing to varying log entries. Some dry as stale bread, others practically love letters to the moon, as evidence that solitude affected keepers differently. And you, standing here with Emmeline's letter folded neatly in your breast pocket, would argue that it's less about loneliness and more about attention, about how deeply you begin to notice the way rust blossoms, or how the light shifts across the water at the same time each day. As if the world, when quiet enough, finally lets you see its choreography. You find yourself humming again, this time something tuneless, just a string of notes tied together like a makeshift rope to keep your thoughts from drifting too far out. And as you descend into the supply room to take inventory, again, even though the numbers rarely change, you begin speaking the items aloud, a strange habit you've developed lately, as if narrating your actions turns them into something more official. Or perhaps it's simply the pleasure of hearing your own voice answer back, even if only an echo. 3 cans beans, 1 dozen candles, 5 wicks, salt, more salt, still more salt. The cat watches from atop a crate like a small judgmental deity, tail twitching in rhythm with your footsteps, and you realize you've started assigning her personality traits she hasn't earned, that she probably doesn't possess, but which amuse you nonetheless, like believing she secretly operates a gossip column for the seabirds or that she's writing her own novella in the dust behind the stove. A story of betrayal and fish theft and revenge, which you sincerely hope ends well for all involved. Outside, a mist begins to form. Not a dramatic fog, not yet. Just a haze that curls around the rocks, like a lazy ghost stretching after a long nap. And you climb the tower again, more out of habit than necessity, checking the lens for smudges that don't exist, ensuring the wick is trimmed, even though it burned clean last night. Because in a life defined by cycles and rituals, every small act becomes its own kind of prayer. And maintenance is devotion in disguise. You wonder, not for the first time, what it would be like to have visitors, not officials or supply men, but people who don't already know the lighthouse's rhythms, who would marvel at the spiral stairs and the smell of salt in the bricks, who might gasp at the view from the top, or ask questions with genuine curiosity instead of procedural duty. And you imagine hosting a tea with mismatched cups and slightly overboiled eggs, sharing stories about the day you caught a fish with your boot, or the night you were certain the moon winked at you. The fog, when it finally comes in earnest, does so quickly, wrapping the tower in its damp embrace until everything feels muted and softened and far away. And you light the lantern early, not because you have to, but because there's something comforting in its glow, in knowing that someone, somewhere out there, might see it and know they're not entirely alone on the sea. And the thought makes your chest ache in that quiet way that isn't quite sadness, but close enough to be familiar. You prepare your reply to Emmeline that night, choosing your words with more care than usual, describing the fog as if it were a character in your life, a house guest who overstays its welcome but occasionally tells a good story. And you slip in a question about her students, hoping she'll reply soon. Not because you're desperate, but because connection, even in small written bursts, reminds you that you still exist in someone else's world. If only for a page or two at a time, as the cat curls around your ankles and the stove hisses its soft lullaby. You finish your tea, extinguish the candle, and glance one last time at the lantern's steady blink out the window. A signal not just to ships, but to yourself. A rhythmic reminder that you're still here, still watching, still keeping. And as the night folds over you like a woolen blanket, slightly too short at the edges, you allow yourself to drift, not just into sleep, but into the gentle, endless rhythm of the light. By the time morning spills across your windows, like a pale, indifferent tide, soft and bleached and quietly insistent, you already know. By the shifting echo of the waves, by the extra creak in the stairwell, by the cat's refusal to rise from the wool blanket that she has unofficially claimed as her own. That today will be one of those odd, in-between days. Not a storm day, nor a sun-blessed day, but one of those limp, slow-turning Tuesdays where everything seems wrapped in gauze, and time itself feels like it's waiting for someone to make a decision, although no one ever does, least of all you. And so you fall into your movements more from muscle memory than urgency, with the sort of resigned grace one develops after years of repetition with no audience. You shuffle into the boots that never quite dry fully this time of year, nod to the stovetop kettle as if it were a co-worker punching in late, and glance toward the ledges that await your attention, though even they, in their sturdy, paper-scented authority, seem to slouch slightly today, as if they too feel the weight of the air, that dense, fog-fed pressure that flattens sounds and makes the entire world feel like it's underwater, or worse, under observation from some unseen creature who neither judges nor intervenes, but merely takes notes and watches with eternal patience, like an old school teacher whose chalk never breaks. Outside, the light is strange, filtered through a blanket of low-hanging clouds that seem to press downward rather than hover overhead. And the sea, usually full of small interruptions and shifting moods, has taken on a kind of eerie stillness, its surface smooth as polished slate, occasionally broken by the lazy breach of a seal or the ghostly drift of seaweed strands that resemble green hair floating in a dream. And you can't help but imagine that if you shouted across the water, the sound wouldn't echo but simply dissolve, swallowed by some ancient hush. So instead of raising your voice, you pick up your binoculars, not because there's anything urgent to survey, but because the habit of scanning the horizon twice a day has become more than protocol. It's become a kind of meditation, a small, deliberate effort to remain present, to affirm that, yes, this rock you stand upon is still a rock, and the ships still occasionally glide past in the far-off lane, and the sky, however tired it may appear, has not yet collapsed into the sea. Your eye catches a small sloop making slow progress northward, its sail angled like a limp handkerchief in the windless air, and you watch for a full minute, long enough to imagine the person at its helm, perhaps a fisherman with too much time and too few fish, or a bored heir playing at sea captain while contemplating whether or not to grow a beard. And you nod at them, even though they cannot see you, because it's important, you think, to acknowledge the other lonely people when you find them, even at a distance, even in silence, even if they're only real in your imagination. The cat, who you've begun calling Minister as a private joke you've never explained to anyone, stretches from her perch and regards you with narrowed eyes that imply she's considering a kook, or at least a reallocation of sleeping spots, and you respond by placing a small, fish-shaped biscuit on the windowsill beside her, a peace offering she accepts with reluctant dignity, as if to remind you that any détente is temporary, and the rules of engagement are subject to revision at any time. And then, as the light continues to rise but never quite brightens, you begin your maintenance rounds. Not because there's a pressing danger of decay or dysfunction, but because these small tasks, performed with care and consistency, are the bones of your sanity, the thread that ties today to yesterday and tomorrow, and without them, you fear your thoughts might begin to unravel like a poorly tied mooring line left too long in salt water. You begin with the lens, of course, always the lens, because it's the heart of everything here. And though it doesn't need cleaning today, you polish it anyway, watching your reflection stretch and bend in the curved glass, your face warped into a carnival shape that somehow looks more honest than your actual expression, and you whisper to yourself, a poem, a list, a string of kitchen supplies from last week's delivery, just to break the silence, just to remind yourself that your voice still exists in the physical world. Historians still argue whether lighthouse keepers were chosen for their dependability or their docility, whether the job attracted the meticulous or merely the forgotten. And you think, as you unspool another length of wick and trim it with the care of a barber in a town with only one customer, that the truth lies somewhere between. That perhaps the keepers were simply people who discovered that solitude could be shaped like clay, molded into something stable and useful, even if it never quite dried. You descend the tower in slow, deliberate steps, counting each one out of habit, reaching 37 by the time your feet find the floor, and you head toward the pantry, taking mental stock of the shelves as you pass. Jars aligned, labels facing outward, tins of beans stacked in proud, silent towers, like soldiers awaiting orders. And you refill your notebook with a few more tallies, a few more notes about salt levels and hinge squeaks, and the unacceptable decline in quality of the last batch of flour, which smelled faintly of old socks, no matter how much you tried to convince yourself otherwise. Later, over a bowl of fish stew that tastes better than it should, thanks to a splash of vinegar and the last of the dried thyme, you read through Emmeline's latest letter, which arrived 2 days ago, but which you deliberately saved for today, knowing somehow that this day would need it, that today would lack the momentum to generate anything new. And so it would need the borrowed energy of another's words, and her letter, as always, provides just that. She writes about a student named Harvey, who insists birds aren't real and tries to prove it by throwing breadcrumbs at pigeons and then accusing them of being government spies when they don't react as expected. She includes a doodle of the goat wearing spectacles and sitting in her classroom, annotated with tiny arrows and the label uninvited but engaged. And she signs off with a question about what dreams you've had lately, which catches you off guard, because you've rarely thought about dreams here. Not because you don't have them, but because they tend to evaporate the moment your feet hit the cold floor, leaving behind only vague impressions. Waves, towers, sometimes an echo of a song you don't recognize but feel like you've known forever. You don't answer her question, not yet, but you write it down in the margin of your own letter, circled twice, as a reminder to pay more attention the next time you wake up, to see if you can bring something back with you, even if it's just a single word or image, something small enough to fit in your pocket and carry through the day like a charm. That night, after the lantern has been checked and the glass has been double-checked, you climb to the top, not because you need to, but because the air up there smells different, sharper, cleaner, with a faint tang of ozone and rust. And you sit beside the great machine, watching it blink and turn like the slow, steady heartbeat of the coastline. And you feel, just for a moment, that you are part of something large and invisible, something that stretches beyond the limits of your island and into the vast quiet of the sea. And in that moment, you remember a childhood game, something about catching stars in a jar, something your brother invented before he left for good. And you laugh quietly, because of course the stars never fit. But the trying was the point, the reaching and the believing and the faint glow that sometimes lingered in the jar's glass the next morning. Even if no one else could see it, you hold that memory like a warm stone in your hand, and you let the night take the rest. By the time the next morning stirs itself into reluctant existence, arriving not with a grand orchestral sunrise, but more like a grumbling guest who forgot their invitation, the island feels even smaller than usual, as if the tide had not just pulled back from the shore, but pulled the very edges of the world inward, shrinking your universe to the dimensions of damp stone walls, creaky wood, and the endless whispering of the wind, which today seems to mutter things just out of reach, like a radio tuned to a forgotten station, broadcasting lullabies in a language no one remembers. And as you step out with your breakfast toast in one hand and a dented spyglass in the other, you have the distinct sense that even time itself has chosen to delay its arrival, hitting snooze somewhere out over the horizon. Your coat, which you left hanging on the peg by the door, still carries the scent of the oil lamp from last night, a faint and ghostly tang that now clings to everything you touch. Paper, blankets, even the cat, who, for the first time in days, has decided that your lap is a suitable throne once more, as though your stillness has met her impossible standards, and for the briefest of moments, you both sit there, staring out the salt-streaked window like two tired old souls, waiting for something absurdly specific to happen. A foghorn, maybe, or a falling star, or perhaps the return of that ridiculous basket of lemons the supply ship dropped overboard last month, and which you still dream about some nights, rolling endlessly through sea foam and regret. You eat slowly, not because you're savoring the bread, which is objectively terrible and one step away from being reclassified as a blunt weapon, but because stretching the task of eating into a 20-minute ritual gives structure to a day that otherwise resembles a melted candle. Shapeless, sticky, and quietly defiant of your attempts to light anything meaningful under it. And you notice how the butter, which you ration like it's made of powdered gold, has formed the faint outline of a bird on the toast. And for no reason at all, you decide it's a raven, and that it's a sign of wisdom, or perhaps bad weather. And in either case, you nod as if that settles it. The logbook calls to you from its usual corner, and though you've already written down the wind speed and sea condition with more flourish than necessary, you add a new entry anyway. Simply, raven-shaped butter omen. Prepare accordingly. You feel that someone, someday, might find these entries, might attempt to piece together your mental decline from the way your handwriting becomes looser and your metaphors more absurd. And the thought brings you a kind of gentle delight, as if you're leaving breadcrumbs in a forest no one visits anymore. Mid-morning drifts into view like a half-forgotten visitor, and with it, the inevitable rituals of upkeep. The lantern's brass must be buffed until it gleams with the smug satisfaction of a mirror that knows it's the only one for miles, and the pulley on the eastern side of the tower, which has been groaning like a disappointed uncle every time you hoist the cleaning platform, finally demands your attention. So you climb up the ladder, muttering a prayer to whoever invented rope tension systems, and begin the slow, greasy work of applying whale oil, which always leaves your hands smelling like the inside of a library that also happens to be a butcher shop. And here, suspended halfway between the sea and the sky, swaying just enough to remind you that nothing is ever fully stable, you begin to hum a tune from childhood, something plucked from an era when you still believed adults had it all figured out. And the sound mingles with the creaking of the rig and the call of a distant gull, creating a kind of accidental symphony that no one will hear and that somehow makes the moment feel like it matters. You remember something you read once, maybe in a letter from Emmeline or buried in the back of a disintegrating almanac, about how in 1838, lighthouse keeper William Harris kept his post for 41 years, without a single day missed, even after breaking his leg, even after losing a son to the sea, and you wonder, not for the first time, whether he was committed or merely too stubborn to let the waves win. And you imagine him, grey-bearded and unsmiling, writing something absurdly poetic like, "The sea gnaws, but I remain," right under his supply orders for beans and salt pork. Historians still argue whether these long-serving keepers were driven by noble duty, crushing loneliness, or simply the inertia of being needed by no one else. And you think that the answer likely shifts with the season, like the direction of the gulls. And some days you feel like a guardian of the coast, and others like a man who misplaced the instructions for returning to civilization and decided it wasn't worth the postage to ask for new ones. When the mailbag finally arrives, tossed from a skiff with more hope than accuracy and retrieved with the sort of dramatic grappling hook maneuver you practice during slow months, it contains one envelope, 2 soggy newspapers, and an orange, which you regard with the awe usually reserved for comets or gods disguised as peasants. And you don't even read the return address before slicing it open with your thumbnail and inhaling the scent of ink and someone else's breath. Faint and papery, but there. It's from Samuel, one of the few remaining correspondents whose penmanship is still legible and whose observations on land life remain a delightful mix of scandalous and mundane. And he writes at length about a town council dispute over the color of the new schoolhouse roof. They chose green, which is either a nod to the hills or an act of war against the blue-trimmed church next door, and includes a sketch of a pig wearing spectacles because she kept staring at me during lunch. And you laugh harder than you have in days, because absurdity, when delivered through ink and distance, is more precious than gold. You reply that night, scratching onto a page that smells faintly of mildew and wax, and you include a drawing of the butter raven and a description of the fog's taste, like sour cotton and misplaced memories. And you thank him for the orange, which you will not eat yet, but instead place on the mantel like a shrine, just beneath the rusty compass you've never used, and beside the smooth stone you found last summer that looks exactly like a curled-up sleeping dog. And you wonder what Samuel would say about your decor, and decide he would approve. Later, as twilight unspools itself like a tired cat across the sky, you light the lantern with care, watching the flame bloom from spark to steady glow, like a secret being born. And as the great lens begins its silent rotation, casting its long gaze out into the nothingness, you press your palm against the cool iron of the railing and close your eyes, just long enough to imagine the ships out there, slicing through fog and darkness, utterly unaware that the light guiding them is tended by a man who once wrote, "Today I combed a cat and she bit me. I deserved it." You return to your chair, where Minister has resumed her vigilant slumber, and you stroke her gently, listening to the rhythmic purring that seems to synchronize with the sea. And for the first time in hours, maybe days, you feel still, not in body but in soul, as if the lighthouse with its groans and draughts and quiet rituals has finally exhaled, and in doing so, given you permission to stop measuring time and simply exist within it. Tomorrow will bring another letter, or maybe not. The fog will roll in again, or it won't. The butter will form a tiger, or perhaps a canoe. But tonight, the orange glows faintly in the firelight. The lamp above casts its sweeping eye toward oblivion, and you sit, very still, in a place that does not ask you to be more than what you are. A keeper of light, a listener to fog, and a silent participant in the long, slow heartbeat of a coastline that rarely speaks but always watches. By the time the sun hauls itself lazily over the eastern edge of the horizon, more yawning than rising, smearing a pale wash of amber across the scattered tufts of cloud that hang like discarded thoughts over the sea, you're already halfway through your morning routine. If one could call it a routine at all, since it is more a gentle negotiation between habit and necessity, choreographed not by any clock. For clocks here tend to be unreliable companions, often slowed by sea salt rust or thrown into moods by the humidity, but rather by the rhythm of the waves and the whims of the wind, which knows no hour and respects no schedule, though it does tend to carry with it, from time to time, the faintest echo of gulls from some far-off colony, or the almost forgotten perfume of pine needles from a shoreline that must be many miles away. You're polishing the lens today, not because it truly needs it, but because you need it. Or rather, you need the feeling of sliding a clean rag in slow circles across curved glass, watching the smears disappear like ghosts being coaxed into rest. And as you move from panel to panel, ascending slightly with each turn, you hum a song that you think may have once been about a river, though now the words elude you entirely, and all you can summon is the tune, wandering in and out of key like an old friend who doesn't knock anymore, just walks into the room and starts eating crackers. This task, though small, always gives you a disproportionate sense of consequence, as though your labor is being translated somehow into safe journeys for ships that will never know your name. And although no one has ever written to thank you personally, except for that one oddly poetic seaman who compared the beacon's flash to a wink from heaven, you still imagine with some satisfaction that somewhere out there a deckhand has raised a cup of strong coffee and muttered, "Glad that light's still working," without ever knowing the quiet persistence behind its glow. The light is not, of course, always appreciated, especially by birds who continue to mistake the great glass eye for a moon worth embracing. And many a morning has begun with the solemn and slightly absurd task of gathering the tiny feathered casualties who dash themselves against its impossible promises. And though you always feel a pang, yes, even for the gulls, who are arrogant little beasts, and frankly deserve the occasional misfortune, you still carry them down the spiral stairs with reverence, as if escorting royalty who tragically misunderstood their itinerary. You bury them in a narrow grove behind the keeper's house, a patch of wind-sheltered grass where even the soil seems to whisper. And while no one instructed you to do this, and certainly there's no regulation demanding that every lost turn be laid to rest with a few kind words and a pine cone, you do it anyway, speaking to each one as if it had been a guest who left too early, telling them, you were aiming too high, that's all. Or you probably had stories, and for reasons you don't fully understand, it makes the mornings softer somehow, like folding a note and tucking it in a drawer you never open again. There's a chair up here, an ancient thing with a crooked back, and one armrest that's been chewed into smoothness by generations of nervous hands, and you sit in it now, letting your gaze stretch out across the ocean, which today is wearing its greyest face. Not the stormy, angry grey of theatrical weather, but that dull, flat, expressionless grey that feels like a stare, as though the sea itself is watching you for once, judging your sweater's unraveling cuff or the smudge on your glasses, and you stare back, unblinking, like two old men, locked in an eternal contest of patience. Somewhere in the distance, a buoy bell tolls, not urgently, but with the weary rhythm of a metronome that knows the song by heart. And it reminds you of something Emmeline once said, or maybe wrote, about how time passes differently by the sea. Not slower exactly, but wider, as if each hour contains more space between its minutes, and you nod at the thought, finding truth in it. Because yes, here, even your thoughts have room to stretch their legs, to sit down and braid each other's hair, to wander off mid-sentence, and come back with a new idea about how potatoes should be categorized. The lighthouse itself creaks sometimes in response, a slow, groaning acknowledgement of your presence, like a grandmother shifting in her rocking chair to say, "Still here, are you?" And you find it oddly comforting, this architectural companionship, this mutual tolerance between man and stone and salt. And you wonder whether the people who designed these towers meant for them to feel alive, or if that's just what happens when a place listens to you for long enough without interrupting. Historians still argue whether lighthouse keepers were more prone to madness because of the isolation, or whether the job simply attracted those who were already a little sideways. But you think it's a bit of both. After all, it takes a certain kind of person to volunteer for this life, to say, yes, I'd like to be alone with my thoughts, the weather, and an enormous flame that could burn down the Atlantic if pointed the wrong way. And you've met others in the service, once, at a coastal gathering years ago, and while none of them were outright mad, there was a certain glint in their eyes, like they'd all been told a secret too heavy to share. Around midday, you descend the stairs slowly, counting each step, not because you need to, but because it feels like a litany, a grounding ritual, something that keeps your thoughts from scattering like leaves in a gust. And when you reach the bottom, you do what you always do on Tuesdays. You pull out the tiny violin from its dusty case, tighten the pegs, and draw the bow across the strings until a sound emerges that is, if you're being generous, closer to music than screaming. You aren't good, haven't been good since you were 10. And Miss Lachlan told your mother you lack discipline, but you enjoy the ritual of it. The way your fingers remember positions even when your ears protest. And you play mostly sea shanties. But sometimes you sneak in a bit of Mozart or a folk tune from a place you've never been, and Minister, unimpressed as always, retreats under the bed until the last note dies, emerging only when she's absolutely sure the cat murdering has ceased. Afterward, with ears ringing and fingers buzzing, you eat lunch, pickled carrots, stale crackers, and a hard-boiled egg that smells like remorse. And you find yourself grateful anyway. Because in this place, meals are less about flavor and more about reminding yourself that you are, in fact, still housed in a body. One that needs tending, even if it no longer complains much about being alone. The afternoon stretches, a cat in the sun, long and content, and you lie back on your cot, the one with the spring that pokes you just enough to make you feel mortal. And you read a passage from the dog-eared volume of poetry that's been your companion for years, the one with notes in the margins from past versions of yourself who thought they were clever. And you smile at a scribbled comment. This poem smells like fish. And wonder what on earth you had meant by that. Outside, the wind has shifted. The kind of subtle change you feel in your jaw before you hear it in the trees. And you rise slowly, like bread in a lazy oven, to check the windows, to peer through the glass that's never quite clean. And you spot a sail on the horizon, tiny and red, like a punctuation mark in an otherwise unbroken sentence of sea. You watch it for a long time, longer than you mean to, and when it finally disappears behind a curtain of mist, you feel something tug in your chest. Not longing exactly, but the recognition of a thing passing by you that once might have been yours. And you go back upstairs, into the warmth of the lantern, into the heartbeat of your post, and prepare once more to be seen by the sea, if only as a flicker in the corner of a sailor's eye. Evening doesn't arrive with any urgency. It sort of drapes itself over the day like a heavy woolen shawl, being casually tossed across the shoulders of an old aunt who never left her rocker. A gradual darkening, not so much a fading of light as a gentle shifting of color temperature. From the tired brass of afternoon into the steely lavender of dusk. And as you step out onto the narrow platform that rings the uppermost part of the lighthouse, the metal cold beneath your soles, even through your worn boots, you watch the shadows grow taller and more confident, spilling across the waves like ink poured in slow motion into a basin of silver tea. Which is to say, not with drama, but with that peculiar hush that only happens at the end of long, wind-heavy days by the sea. The lantern has already begun its slow, solemn rotation, its beam sweeping the grey Atlantic with the tired dignity of a butler, performing a service he's been asked to repeat for the 1000th time. And you stand beside it like a sentry, not because you need to. There's nothing to correct or adjust at this moment, but because you like to be there when the light begins its conversation with the night, sending coded messages in long, rhythmic flashes that only the ocean and its travelers truly understand. And for a fleeting moment, you fancy the idea that the beam is not just a warning, but a language, a dialect made of fire and glass, one that says, "Here we are," and also, We've been here all along. Below, the windows of the keeper's quarters glow faintly. Yellow-orange puddles of warmth that promise soup and solitude. And you know that soon you'll descend again. Not because of cold or weariness, but because routine, for all its dull reputation, has a gravity stronger than nostalgia. And you'll find yourself folding laundry that doesn't really need folding. Aligning spoons in a drawer that no one else ever opens, and muttering commentary aloud about the creaking of the floorboards, as if they were an unruly theater audience that needed gentle reprimand before the show could continue. And yet tonight, before you return below, you linger a little longer, raising your arms on the cold railing and inhaling the sharp salt air until it singes the inner corners of your nostrils in that familiar way, reminding you that yes, you're still here, still breathing, still part of this fast, irrelevant choreography between sky and water. And as your eyes scan the undulating horizon, no ships visible now, only the distant blinking of another lighthouse many miles north. A cousin, perhaps, sharing its own dull stories with whatever night creatures happen to pass by. You feel again that curious intimacy that arises only in true isolation. The sense that you are not so much alone as deeply embedded in something ancient, something too slow-moving to be noticed by city dwellers or train conductors or newspapermen. There is, of course, a journal waiting for you downstairs, not a proper logbook like the one that receives the weather and the ship sightings and the mechanical details of the lantern's upkeep, but a personal volume tucked behind a loose board in the pantry where you once stored onions until Minister decided onions were enemies and declared war on them in your absence. And this journal contains no profound observations, no great declarations of loneliness or philosophical quandaries about light versus darkness, but rather lists, long, meandering, and mildly deranged lists of things like birds that have judged me, sounds the fog makes that resemble words, and dreams where I'm a spoon. And you will write in it tonight, of course, as you always do when the wind shifts a certain way, or when the sea gives you that look, the one that says, "What else have you got?" And you'll scribble a few lines about a fish that stared too long at the tower before vanishing, or about the uncanny resemblance between a dying wave and the sigh of a disappointed aunt. And you'll close the book not with satisfaction, but with a vague sense of having been mildly possessed, as if something older and funnier than you borrowed your hand for a few minutes and then left without paying rent. Historians still argue whether the isolation of lighthouse keepers led to an increase in what was then delicately termed melancholy drift, or whether the constant exposure to light, in a paradoxical twist, somehow aggravated the shadows of the mind. And while some letters recovered from remote stations hint at unease, keepers describing mirrors they refuse to use after sundown, or dreams of endless staircases coiled around nothing, you think, as you pour yourself a cup of overstewed tea, that perhaps it's not madness, but simply too much noticing, the way you begin to observe the exact moment when a pane of glass ceases to reflect the sun and begins to reflect only you, and that this over-noticing, rather than misfiring brains or cursed proximity to rocks, is what frays the edges of a keeper's mental map. The kettle whistles low, like a secret being told badly, and you pour its contents into your chipped mug, the one with the crude painting of a whale that looks more like a baked potato wearing a hat. And you cradle the warmth between your palms, letting the steam rise and blur your glasses just enough to render the room pleasantly shapeless. And you sit at the small kitchen table, where the wood has been carved into with idle knives over the years, revealing initials you never bothered to decode. And perhaps that's for the best, because imagining T.M. as a fellow keeper from 1847 who once wrestled a ghost crab from a rain barrel is far more comforting than learning it stood for table maintenance. Dinner tonight is a sad affair. One remaining potato, half a jar of pickled beets, and a piece of hardtack so ancient it might have been blessed by a colonial priest. But you eat it slowly, not out of reverence, but because crunching things very slowly is one of the few remaining leisure activities left to you. And Minister watches from atop the cabinet with the disgusted expression of a queen betrayed. No doubt planning some petty revenge, perhaps involving a shredded curtain or a mysterious puddle placed strategically inside your boot. Later, wrapped in 2 sweaters, one of which has more holes than thread, you sit by the tiny stove, which glows like a satisfied memory of fire, and you read the same 3 pages of that novel you've never finished for the 100th time. Not because the story is compelling, honestly you can't remember half the names, but because the paper smells faintly of lavender and pipe smoke, and the way the ink has faded at the edges makes it feel as though the story is retreating from you on purpose, challenging you to chase it, which of course you never do, preferring instead to let it escape, a sentence at a time, into the murky folds of night. You light your final lamp, an old oil burner with a bent chimney and a wick that smells like dusty nostalgia, and place it by the window, not because anyone will see it, but because you like to imagine some sailor out there, lost and muttering, glancing up at your tower and saying, there's someone home after all, even though you know full well they're more likely to consult a chart, curse the wind, and down another mouthful of salt pork before collapsing into dreams filled with cannons and unpaid debts. And as the night settles into itself, breathing slow and deep, like an animal curled in straw, you make one last round through the tower, checking the hinges, tapping the barometer, whispering to the walls just in case they've developed a sense of humor in your absence. And when at last you climb back up to the lantern room, standing once again in that glass and iron halo that turns slowly, slowly, slowly above the indifferent sea, you allow yourself one indulgent thought, that perhaps, just perhaps, every spin of that beam is not merely a function, but a benediction, a blessing wrapped in oil fumes and iron, offering protection not just to ships and sailors, but to yourself, to the crumbling wood underfoot, to Minister's superior eyebrows, and even to the endless quiet that fills the spaces between all the creaks, reminding you that silence, too, can be faithful. You wait to the sound of fog, or rather, the absence of all other sound, wrapped neatly inside a thick, damp blanket of fog, the kind that presses its soft hands against every window pane and nestles into the seams of your jacket and makes even the loudest footfalls sound like gentle confessions whispered across wet wool. And as you sit up in bed, not because of an alarm or a rooster or even minister, who remains firmly asleep in a proud loaf shape on top of your folded laundry, you realize that the air smells vaguely of rust and cold soup, which is either a warning or simply breakfast announcing itself early. Getting dressed is a ritual performed with the resigned enthusiasm of a priest anointing bricks, each layer of clothing pulled on with the vague hope that it will keep out the damp, though of course it never quite does, and as you button your third flannel shirt over your second, which itself is over a woolen undershirt, with one sleeve permanently askew, you catch sight of yourself in the mirror, the one you rarely use except to confirm you're still, technically, present, and your face looks less like a portrait and more like a poorly remembered sketch. All smudged lines and slightly haunted expressions, the kind of face someone in a Victorian novel might describe as weathered, which is just polite code for has seen a lot of wind and disappointment. You make your way up the spiral stairs to the lantern room, each step groaning in a register that suggests betrayal more than fatigue. And when you reach the top and push open the metal door, you're greeted not with a view, but with a wall of white, so complete, so arrogantly featureless, that you half expect a stagehand to appear and apologize for having not painted the backdrop yet. And the foghorn, naturally, has taken this opportunity to begin its mournful declarations, bellowing every few minutes, like a lonely beast, calling across a sea that has stopped listening. And while some find it eerie, you've come to find it comforting, like an old friend shouting just to let you know they're still alive and still incredibly loud. The foghorn itself is a beast of brass and steam and sulking valves, and you descend into its chamber to check that it hasn't decided to explode or develop opinions. And as you tinker with a lever here and a pipe there, wiping condensation from a pressure gauge that has never once told the truth, you think of the keepers who came before you, men who wore stiff collars and had names like Obadiah and Lemuel, and wrote letters to their sisters in prose so flowery it could choke a daffodil. And you wonder if they, too, cursed the foghorn for waking them, only to later miss its voice when the skies were clear and silence fell too heavy on their ears. Historians still argue whether lighthouse foghorns were more effective as navigational aids or psychological anchors, whether their real purpose was to guide ships through obscured paths or simply to remind the keepers, lost in their own domestic labyrinths of soup tins and soaked socks, that the world beyond the fog still existed and occasionally needed a reminder of its own. And you find yourself oddly charmed by the idea that a blast of sound every 4 minutes might be the only thing tethering someone's sanity to the coastline. After a breakfast of lukewarm oatmeal that tastes faintly of iron and yesterday's regret, you settle into your day's work with the plodding determination of a mule that knows the cart isn't going anywhere exciting, but still pulls because pulling is what mules do. And today's tasks involve not the grand or heroic, but the profoundly mundane. Checking for rust on the outer gallery railings, scraping moss from the north side stairs, and recording the barometric pressure every hour even though the barometer is about as accurate as a toddler describing the stock market. Out on the narrow ledge that wraps around the lantern room, you crouch and scrape with a flat blade, flaking away bits of green that cling to the stones like stubborn memories. And as you do, the fog curls around your legs like a bored house cat, occasionally parting just enough to offer a glimpse of the sea. Flat and colorless, a sullen sheet stretched over the edge of the world. And in those moments, you feel not relief or joy, but the odd sense that the lighthouse is a living thing, exhaling fog, the way trees exhale stories, and that you are merely another one of its many organs, scraping, checking, logging, waiting. Inside again, you pause to dry your boots by the stove, which sulks in its corner, puffing out warmth with the temper of a grandparent who doesn't approve of your life choices, but still offers you tea. And as you sit on the short stool, your official thinking stool, though its only real function is to be in the way, you pull out your map of the local coast, not because you need directions, you'd need to leave for that to be useful, but because you enjoy tracing the curves of the shore with your finger, imagining the invisible paths taken by fish and fog and rumor. You mark the logbook with the day's observations: wind direction, confused; cloud cover, complete; sea state, apathetic. And then you pause, considering whether or not to note the squirrel you briefly glimpsed running along the rocks near the base of the tower, but ultimately decide against it, reasoning that unless it applies for a job or tries to enter the pantry, it remains irrelevant to maritime safety. And yet, the memory of the squirrel stays with you, not because it was doing anything particularly impressive. It was, in fact, alarmingly ordinary, but because the sudden appearance of something small and fast and alive in this place of slow cycles and long pauses was jarring, almost like watching someone sprint through a funeral or sing at a tax audit. And for a brief moment, you felt the absurdity of your routine stretched taut against the reality of other, more frenetic lives just beyond the curtain of mist. Later in the afternoon, the fog thins just enough to allow light to leak through in strange patterns, like old lace laid over a window. And you find yourself staring at the beams as they angle across the floorboards, forming shapes that you half recognize from dreams or old family photos, or perhaps that one time you stared too long at a potato and thought it looked judgmental. And you stand there, letting the warmth pool on your feet, the kind of warmth that isn't hot, but simply the absence of cold, which in a lighthouse is often all you can hope for. You spend some time organizing your bookshelf, a grand term for a few warped planks that hold 7 books, 3 of which are missing covers, and 2 of which you've never finished. And you alphabetize them not by title or author, but by how trustworthy you find their narrators, a system that makes sense only to you and to no one else. And as you do this, Minister watches with thinly veiled contempt, clearly unimpressed by your literary discernment, and even less impressed by your habit of occasionally reading aloud to the teapot. Dinner is a hearty stew, made from things you didn't know you had, and still aren't sure you should have eaten. But it warms the belly and makes the stove crackle with something like approval. And as you eat, you watch the sun finally begin to win its battle with the fog, sending slanted rays through the cloud bank like golden spears hurled by a very tired but still dramatic god. And you toast your spoon in honor of the victory, knowing full well the fog will return tomorrow with its damp sighs and heavy silences. And when the stars finally appear, tentative and blinking, like someone trying to remember the words to a song they last heard years ago, you climb once again to the top of the tower. Not because it's required, but because it feels right. And you stand beside the lantern, watching its slow spin carve invisible trails across the night. And you whisper something to the beam. Not words exactly, more of a feeling wrapped in breath. And hope that somewhere, out on that dark sea, someone feels it pass over them like a blessing, or at the very least, like a gentle reminder that they are not entirely alone. You've read it before, twice in fact. And yet, on this unremarkably grey afternoon, as the wind lulls into a rare and almost suspicious stillness, you find yourself slipping the same book from its slightly damp leather binding, its cover warped by years of foggy windows and a humid lantern room, its spine cracked in just the same places you cracked it last season, and the season before that, and possibly when you were still a bit younger and had the delusion that reading Moby Dick while surrounded by nothing but sea would somehow feel immersive, even meaningful, even though the only real whales you've ever seen were the ones sketched badly in your Lighthouse's guest logbook by a passing sailor with too much grog and not enough artistic restraint. You settle into your creaky wooden chair, the one you once tried to fix with leftover lantern oil and a particularly sticky barnacle, which did not improve either the chair or the barnacle's disposition. And you open to the first page, already resigned to the fact that Ishmael is about to introduce himself again, with all the moody gusto of a man who clearly needs a therapist and not a whaling expedition. And yet, you admire his commitment to monologuing about cetaceans. Because frankly, if anyone can compete with the loneliness of a lighthouse keeper, it's a guy floating on a wooden coffin, trying to avenge a grudge against a fish. And so you read, slowly at first, lips barely moving as your eyes skim each well-worn paragraph. But then, you find your rhythm again, the way one does when returning to an old walking path, where every tree leans just as it did before, and every puddle appears predictably after that one particularly low-hanging branch that always tries to thwack your forehead. And you remember that there's comfort in repetition, in knowing the arc before the drama begins, and you let the tide of Melville's madness wash over you like the fog that crept in this morning and never quite left. The cat jumps onto the table without apology, of course, stepping delicately on your place in the book, as though she, too, disapproves of your choice in literature, and would rather you read something with more birds and fewer existential metaphors. But you brush her gently aside, pretending not to notice that she shed exactly 1,000 hairs across the only paragraph that doesn't mention blubber. And she gives you a look that says, quite clearly, this is why no one visits you. Outside, a gull screams again, possibly the same gull that nested last spring on your chimney and dropped clamshells with alarming aim at the garden rake, as though it held a personal vendetta against your vegetables, or maybe just against rakes in general. And you glance toward the window, noticing the way the afternoon light slices across the salt-speckled glass, refracting slightly from the one pane you haven't yet cleaned this week, the one you keep meaning to reach with the long-handled sponge, but never quite manage before the wind picks up and makes the entire endeavor feel like an audition for a soggy circus act. The book flutters in your hand as the breeze, slight but sudden, slips through the poorly sealed window frame again, carrying with it the faint scent of seaweed, mildew, and something else. Something like wet rope, or possibly old tobacco, or perhaps just the accumulated smell of time spent near too many things that once floated and now rust quietly beneath the waves. You shift in your chair, letting one foot rest against the warm patch of floor the sun has managed to touch. That one spot near the pantry that inexplicably gathers heat even on cloudy days. And you wonder, just for a moment, if it's some residual magic, some lighthouse secret buried deep under layers of plank and nail and the ghosts of old keepers who also read too slowly and polished things that didn't need polishing. And maybe even they reread this same book, hoping to uncover some hidden chapter that might break the monotony, or at least explain why there are 14 different words for whale anatomy, and not one decent word for board. Historians still argue whether lighthouse keepers were issued books by the Lighthouse Board itself, or whether they simply brought their own meager collections from home. You recall absently that one note scribbled in the margin of your lighthouse manual by a predecessor who underlined it 3 times, as though it held the key to unraveling the entire purpose of this life. A life of lamps and logs, foghorns and fiddly maintenance, solitude and, yes, reading the same story again and again, because it's better than listening to the walls creak and your own thoughts echo too loudly. The cat returns, of course, this time curling herself directly on your lap, a grudging gesture of companionship that you accept with the reverence of a royal appointment. And as she purrs, roughly, like a motorboat churning gravel, you feel your eyelids begin to droop, just a little, lulled by the rhythm of her breathing and the sound of the waves far below, slapping half-heartedly against the rocks, as though even they are too tired to muster enthusiasm today. You pause your reading, just long enough to trace a finger across the inside cover, where a note from a long-ago friend, maybe a former keeper, maybe someone who once sent you a care package of pickled beans and a newspaper 2 months out of date, reads, "Don't let the sea get too quiet, or it'll start whispering back." You close the book slowly, letting the soft thump of its cover settling shut echo through the otherwise still room, and you lean your head back, letting your gaze fall on the slowly swinging lantern above, its glass smudged by moths and memory, and you wonder how many other keepers sat in this very chair, reading this very passage, watching the cat sleep and waiting, always waiting, for the next wave, the next gust, the next nothing. And you think, just briefly, that maybe you'll read it again tomorrow. Maybe you wake before dawn, not with a start, not with panic, but in that slow-motion way where your body decides, without consulting you, that the dreams have faded enough, and now it is time to be still again, but this time while conscious, which honestly doesn't feel all that different, except your eyes are open now, And there's a vague awareness of socks needing mending and oil lamps needing checking and something in the pantry you might need to write down before you forget, although you've already forgotten what it was. And so you lie there under the thin wool blanket that still smells faintly of salt and tallow and the ghost of last month's cabbage stew, just letting the faint orange glow creep across the ceiling beams like a stage hand raising a curtain on yet another quietly uneventful performance. You don't rush to get up. There's no point, really, since the sun is doing all the work and the sea isn't going anywhere. And besides, the cat has anchored herself squarely atop your legs with the firm, immovable certainty of someone who has never once in her life been told no. And you figure, just for a moment longer, it's fine to pretend she is keeping you prisoner in your own bed, that you would rise valiantly and begin your heroic lighthouse duties, if not for the weight of feline obligation, pinning you to the mattress with all the gravity of a half-empty flour sack. Eventually you do rise, swinging your legs over the side with the grace of someone not entirely convinced vertical life is worth it today. And your toes meet the cold wooden floor, which greets you with the same splintery indifference it offered yesterday and every day before that. And you shuffle toward the stove with the mechanical instinct of a lighthouse keeper who knows that coffee must happen before the brain begins pretending to care about light rotations or brass polish, or whether the gulls have knocked over the rain barrel again, as the kettle hisses and groans like an old sailor with weathered knees. You glance out the tiny round window that offers a sliver of sea view between two barnacle-crusted shutters, and you see the waves moving, not crashing, not rolling, just moving in that hypnotic way that looks like breathing, slow and even and eternal, as if the ocean has never once in its ancient existence been in a hurry. And maybe that's the trick. Maybe that's what you've learned in all these years of fog and silence and spare oil rations. That the sea does not need to impress you with drama to remain infinitely powerful. You sip your coffee from the chipped mug, the one with the faded anchor on the side that's somehow become your favorite, despite the fact it leaks slightly from a hairline crack, and you wrap yourself in your old coat. Not because it's cold, really, but because it still smells faintly of linseed oil and fresh rope, and you like the way those scents make you feel a little more solid, a little more connected to all the keepers before you, who also wrap themselves in cloth and solitude and routine. You begin your rounds, starting with the stairs, of course, always the stairs, winding up and up and up until your calves ache and the lamp room greets you with a gust of stale air and a thin film of dust that you wipe away without thinking, your hand finding the cloth in your pocket before your brain has even issued the order. Because this is your rhythm now, your music, the choreographed ballet of lint and soot and silence, where every step and turn and lean is part of a dance that has no audience and no applause, but still must be performed day after day, because the light must shine. You polish the brass because that's what you do, even though no one will see it but you. And maybe a passing albatross with discerning taste, and as your rag circles the same worn section of railing, you catch your own reflection in the curved glass. And for a moment, you see someone you don't quite recognize. Older, yes. And maybe a bit thinner. Definitely more freckled. But there's something else in that reflection. Something almost content. Like a person who has made peace with the fact that life is mostly maintenance and the occasional storm. And you think, maybe that's enough. You check the logbook, flipping past entries written in your own cramped scrawl and a few older ones written in finer, inkier hands. Names you don't know. Dates that stretch back decades. Comments like, lamp oil low again, or saw dolphins at dawn, or, more mysteriously, heard music from the sea last night, which you always found charming and slightly unnerving, even though you once convinced yourself that the sound of the foghorn bouncing off the cliffs really did resemble a cello if you squinted hard enough and tilted your head just so. You write your own entry for the day. Something simple like lamplit on time, gulls allowed, coffee week. And you pause a moment, considering whether to add anything poetic, but then decide against it. Because this isn't a novel, it's a Lighthouse log. And while your life might be full of slow wonder and soft repetition, there's still a part of you that finds great joy in recording mundane facts, as though they were sacred truths. The cat finds you again, of course, weaving around your ankles with the exaggerated grace of a ballerina on sea legs. And you stoop to scoop her up, pressing her warm little body to your chest. Her purring so loud now, it's practically a declaration of ownership. And you walk to the window together, watching the fishing boats drift along the horizon like crumbs on a blue tablecloth, their sails fluttering faintly in the early morning breeze. And for a moment, you wonder if they ever look up at your light and think about you. The anonymous keeper of glow and signal, the person who wakes before dawn to keep their nights safe. You doubt it, but you don't mind, really, because there's a certain quiet pride in doing something necessary, even if no one notices. And the truth is, you'd probably do it anyway, even if no one ever did. And then it's time for another cup of coffee, another walk around the gallery, another check of the pantry where the potatoes are starting to look at you with concern. And as you pass the old radio that hasn't worked properly in years, but still hums faintly when the weather changes, you hum back, a little off-key, and the cat blinks at you like she's heard worse. Somewhere in the lighthouse, a board creaks, a gull cackles, a wave slaps lazily against the stone, and the kettle groans again, ready for its encore. And so the day begins again, as it always does, quietly, stubbornly, beautifully. And now as the lamp burns low and the last glimmers of orange fade from the sky into a calm velvet grey, you lean against the cold iron railing of the upper balcony, the one just outside the lantern room, and feel the salt air kiss your cheeks one last time for the evening. Soft and slow, like a memory you didn't know you needed. The sea, steady as always, breathes in and out with that same old lullaby rhythm, a sound that's wrapped around your ears. So many nights it's become part of your bones, like the ticking of your old brass clock downstairs, or the crackling of the fire in the stove, or the rustle of the gulls finding their nests among the rocks. You head back down slowly, your hand trailing along the stair rail that's worn smooth by years of palms just like yours. All of them ordinary people doing something quietly, extraordinary, keeping the light alive while the rest of the world slept. There is no fanfare, no ceremony, no applause. Just your quiet boots, your quiet breath, and your quiet lighthouse, standing tall while the world turns gently beneath the stars. You blow out the last lantern and pull the blanket over your shoulders, the cat curling up beside you with a final sigh of approval. And you realize that for all the winds and storms and long, empty silences, you've never once truly felt alone here. Because in the gentle rhythm of tending, of watching, of listening, something ancient and peaceful has taken root in you. So close your eyes now. Let the waves do the talking. Let the light do the watching. And let the night carry you quietly, safely, softly into sleep.